Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. There are moments in history when a single death does not end a story, but opens a door that no one can close again. Julius Caesar was killed by men who believed they were saving the Roman Republic, yet within days of his funeral, Rome was no longer moving back toward its old freedom. It was moving toward a new kind of power, carried first by grief, then by vengeance, then by a young heir almost nobody feared enough. That heir was Gaius Octavius, soon to become Caesar's adopted son, then Octavian, and finally Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. His rise was not inevitable. It passed through betrayal, civil war, propaganda, family loss, careful legality, and the strange Roman habit of changing everything while insisting that nothing had changed at all. If you enjoy these long-form historical journeys, a like and subscribe helps Quiet Chronicles keep bringing them each week. And let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, as well as any person, story, civilization, or era you would like covered next. For now, the story begins not with a crown, nor with an emperor, but with a body in the forum, a crowd gathering in anger, and a funeral that gave Caesar's name a life of its own. Chapter 1. The funeral that opened the future. Julius Caesar's murder was meant to be an ending, and for a few uncertain hours in Rome, it may have looked almost like one. The dictator had fallen in the meeting place of the Senate, surrounded by men who believed that a single violent act could give the Republic back to itself. Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators had struck at the body of the man they saw as a king in everything except the name. Yet Rome was not a machine that could be reset by removing one part. Caesar had filled too many offices, bound too many soldiers, pardoned too many enemies, rewarded too many followers, and frightened too many rivals for his death to leave the city calm. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, the assassins had prepared the killing more carefully than they had prepared the aftermath. They had chosen a public act, before senators, in a place associated with law and authority, because they wanted the murder to look like the recovery of Roman liberty rather than a private ambush. Brutus had the name of an old liberator behind him, the memory of Lucius Junius Brutus, who was said to have helped drive out Rome's kings centuries earlier. Cassius had military experience and a sharper sense of danger. Other senators joined from fear, resentment, principle, ambition, or some mixture that even they may not have separated clearly. Once Caesar was dead, however, they had no army in the city, no firm control of the treasury, no settled agreement with Caesar's supporters, and no clear answer to the question that mattered most immediately: who now governed Rome? Mark Antony understood the danger faster than many of them did. He was consul that year, Caesar's colleague in the highest regular office of the Republic, and his position gave him more than personal loyalty to the dead man. It gave him access to the machinery of public business. Caesar's papers, Caesar's appointments, Caesar's plans for offices and provinces, and Caesar's intended acts all became political tools in Antony's hands. Lepidus, another Caesarian and master of the horse, had troops near the city and briefly seemed ready to avenge the murder by force. The conspirators withdrew to the Capitoline Hill, the old sacred height of Rome, where they could claim symbolism but not command. In that first unsettled balance, the assassins had the language of liberty, while Caesar's men had offices, documents, and soldiers close enough to matter. A compromise followed, and it already showed how difficult Caesar's death would be to contain. The Senate agreed to an amnesty for the assassins, sparing Rome an immediate descent into open fighting inside the city. At the same time, Caesar's acts were confirmed because too many citizens, office holders, veterans, and allies depended on decisions he had already made. To cancel everything Caesar had done would have punished not only the dead dictator's closest friends, but also men who had received offices, settlements, citizenship, land promises, and legal benefits under his authority. The murderers had wanted to free the Republic from Caesar, But the Republic now had to preserve much of Caesar's work in order to keep itself from unraveling. That was one of the first signs that the old order could no longer separate itself cleanly from the man it had killed. Caesar's funeral became the point where this unstable compromise began to fail. Funerals in aristocratic Rome were public acts of memory as well as private rites. A noble family did not merely bury its dead, it displayed ancestry, honors, offices, and service to the state. Wax masks of ancestors could be carried in procession. Speeches recalled the greatness of the family, and the body became the center of a political memory shared before the people. Caesar's funeral belonged to that tradition, but it also exceeded it. He was not only a dead aristocrat, he was the recent dictator, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor in civil war, the man who had pardoned many enemies and gathered unprecedented honors around his person. A ceremony for him could not remain only ceremonial. Antony's role at the funeral was delicate, and that delicacy made it powerful. He could not openly reject the senatorial compromise without risking immediate conflict, yet he could let the facts of Caesar's death speak in a way that no decree could easily silence. The sources differ in details, as they often do when public emotion and political memory are involved, but the central shape is clear enough. Caesar's will was read. His gifts to the Roman people were made known. Each citizen was to receive a sum of money, traditionally given as 75 drachmas, and Caesar's gardens across the Tiber were left for public use. These details mattered because they turned Caesar from a ruler accused of tyranny into a benefactor whose generosity could be counted, repeated, and carried through the crowd. The body itself carried another argument. Accounts describe a wax image of Caesar, showing the wounds raised or displayed so that the people could see what the knives had done. Whether every detail later reported was exact or sharpened by memory, the political meaning of the display was unmistakable. The assassins had spoken of liberty, but the crowd was being asked to look at murder. Antony did not need to produce a theory of monarchy or republican failure. He could place Caesar's honors, wounds, and gifts before the people and allow grief to become judgment. Rome's public life had always depended on visible signs, and at the funeral the signs favored the dead man. The crowd did not respond like a people relieved from oppression. Anger moved through the forum, and the ceremony became less manageable as emotion gathered around the body. A funeral pyre was made in the public space itself, and people brought objects to feed the flames. Benches, clothing, ornaments, and offerings were thrown into the burning. The dead Caesar, who had crossed the Rubicon and defeated Pompey, now became a presence around which the urban people expressed both mourning and accusation. This was not yet an army marching for vengeance. It was something more immediate and less disciplined, a city discovering that the men who killed Caesar had not persuaded the people that Caesar deserved to die. For Brutus and Cassius, the funeral revealed the weakness in their entire design. They had imagined, or at least hoped, that Rome would understand the assassination through the old story of tyrannicide. A ruler reaching toward kingship had been removed, and the Republic could breathe again. But Caesar's place in Roman life was not contained by constitutional principle. To many senators, he was dangerous. To many soldiers, he was the commander who had given them victory and expectation. To many ordinary citizens, he was the man whose name was attached to public games, distributions, clemency, and promised benefits. The assassins had killed him in the name of an old political language, but public feeling did not obey that language in any simple way. Antony's advantage grew from this confusion, yet he was not free from danger himself. He had to speak for Caesar without appearing so openly vengeful that the Senate and the conspirators united against him at once. He also had to manage Caesar's legacy without knowing how quickly a new claimant might appear. Caesar had no legitimate son living in Rome to inherit his position in the ordinary manner. There were relatives, allies, officers, and political dependents, but no obvious adult successor who could step forward with universal recognition. Antony may have believed that he, as consul and close associate, could become the principal interpreter of Caesar's acts. For a brief moment, that belief did not seem unreasonable. The will changed that calculation. Caesar had adopted his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his son and heir. In Roman law and custom, adoption was not a sentimental gesture. It transferred name, inheritance, and family identity with a seriousness that modern habits can easily underestimate. A young man adopted by will into Caesar's house could become Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, though history knows him most often in this period as Octavian. He would inherit not merely property, but a name charged with military loyalty and public expectation. The fact that he was young made him seem manageable to some and insignificant to others. That was a mistake Rome would spend years correcting. At the time of Caesar's funeral, Octavius was not yet the master of events. He was across the Adriatic, at Apollonia, where he had been studying and preparing in the orbit of Caesar's planned eastern campaign. He had companions there, including Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, whose importance would grow with every crisis ahead. News of the assassination had to travel before it could become a decision. While Rome burned with rumor, anger, and funeral smoke, the heir himself was still absent, and absence gave other men time to misjudge him. Antony could look at the will and see an inconvenience. Cicero could later look at the young man and see an instrument. Veterans could look at Caesar's adopted son and see the continuation of a bond they already understood. Caesar's name was the greatest possession Octavian inherited, but it was also a danger. A name could summon loyalty only if the man carrying it survived long enough to reward that loyalty. It could attract veterans, but it could also attract assassins. It could make him visible to the people. But visibility in Rome after the Ides of March was not safety. Octavian would have to decide whether to accept the inheritance fully, knowing that to become Caesar's son was to enter the unfinished quarrel over Caesar's death. Refusal might have preserved his private life. Acceptance would place him among men older, richer, more experienced, and already stained by civil war. Rome, meanwhile, did not settle after the funeral. The conspirators found the city increasingly unsafe and withdrew from the immediate center of politics. Antony gained room to maneuver, using Caesar's papers and the consulship to confirm acts, distribute favors, and strengthen his position. The Senate tried to preserve balance, but balance depended on men who trusted each other less with each passing week. Caesar's veterans watched closely. The urban crowd had shown where its emotion lay. The language of liberation had not disappeared, yet it no longer commanded the city by itself. In the spaces between law, memory, and armed loyalty, a new contest began to form. What makes these days so important is not that anyone yet knew Augustus was coming. No one at Caesar's funeral could see the full shape of the Principate, the settlements of 27 and 23 BC, the long reign, the censuses, the marriage laws, the roads, the temples, the succession problems, or the title by which Octavian would later be remembered. The future did not arrive as a plan. It arrived first as a set of unresolved claims: Caesar's murder, Antony's office, the Senate's fear, the people's anger, the veterans' expectations, and a will naming a young heir who had still to decide what kind of life he was willing to enter. A Roman funeral was supposed to place the dead within memory. Caesar's funeral did something more restless. It made the dead man politically active again, giving his name fresh force at the very moment his enemies hoped to bury his power with him. The pyre in the forum consumed the body, but it did not consume the obligations, resentments, and ambitions gathered around him. Those passed outward through Rome, along roads and sea routes, into letters, conversations, military camps, senatorial calculations, and the mind of a young man at Apollonia. That young man had been born Gaius Octavius, from a family respectable but not commanding at the highest level of Roman nobility. Caesar's will changed his name before it changed his power. To claim that name, he would have to return to Italy, face Antony, court soldiers, endure senatorial suspicion, and learn the brutal grammar of Roman survival. Caesar's funeral had opened the future, but the future still needed someone bold enough or desperate enough to step into it. Chapter 2. The young heir from Velitrae. Gaius Octavius was not born into the center of Roman power, though he was never far from its edges. His family came from Velitrae, an old town in the Alban Hills southeast of Rome, close enough to the capital to belong to its world, but not old enough in Roman nobility to command automatic reverence from the greatest houses. The Octaviae had money, local standing, and equestrian respectability, but they did not carry the weight of names like Cornelius, Claudius, Emilius, or Julius. In the Republic, lineage mattered because it gave a man a past before he had acted in the present. Octavius began with a useful family, not a commanding one. His father, also named Gaius Octavius, had risen higher than the family's older position might have promised. He served as governor of Macedonia and was respected as a capable public man, though death removed him before his son could grow under his direct guidance. The younger Octavius was still a child when his father died, and this left his mother, Actium, and his wider family network with unusual importance in shaping his future. Actium was the daughter of Julius Caesar's sister, and through her the boy stood within the outer circle of the Julian house. That connection did not make him Caesar's obvious successor. It made him visible to Caesar, and in Roman politics, visibility to a powerful relative could become the beginning of everything else. Actium's place in his life matters because Roman aristocratic childhood was never only domestic. A boy's household taught him not merely manners, but rank, obligation, memory, and expectation. Women of elite families carried family continuity with a seriousness often hidden behind the public offices held by men. Actium guarded her son's health, reputation, and access, and ancient writers remembered her as cautious where ambition might have pushed too quickly. Octavius's grandmother Julia, Caesar's sister, also connected him to a family whose public meaning grew larger as Caesar rose. When Julia died, the young Octavius delivered the funeral speech, an act of public speaking that placed him before Roman eyes while he was still too young for office. That funeral speech was one of the first signs that Caesar was willing to draw the boy forward. Roman boys of rank learned by watching older men, attending public business, listening in courts, and absorbing the rhythms of a political world that rewarded memory as much as courage. Octavius did not grow up as a soldier first. He grew up inside the disciplines of elite preparation, where the body, the voice, the family name, and the timing of public appearances all mattered. He was not physically imposing. Later accounts often stress his fragile health, and whether every detail is exact or shaped by later knowledge, the general impression is consistent. He was a young man whose authority would have to come from calculation, association, and endurance, rather than from the immediate force of presence. Caesar's own rise changed the meaning of every connection around him. During the civil war against Pompey and the senatorial faction, the Roman world learned that Caesar was not simply another noble competing for honors. He commanded armies whose loyalty had been formed over years in Gaul, and he possessed a political imagination willing to cross limits that older men still hoped would hold. Octavius was too young to play a major role in those decisive campaigns, but he was old enough to understand that the republic he was entering was not the republic described in ancestral speeches. Offices remained, elections continued, and senators still debated, but armed loyalty had become the final argument beneath public language. Caesar seems to have tested and encouraged him gradually. Octavius was named to the College of Pontiffs, a religious office that placed him among important public figures before he had earned distinction through magistracy. He wanted to accompany Caesar in the African campaign against the Pompeian forces, but illness delayed him, and this detail, small as it seems, belongs to the pattern of his early life. He was repeatedly near great events without yet controlling them. In Spain, After Caesar's campaign against the sons of Pompey, Octavius made his way to join him, reportedly after difficulties at sea and on the road. Caesar noticed the effort. For a man like Caesar, who valued speed, nerve, and personal loyalty, the attempt may have mattered almost as much as battlefield service would have. The relationship between Caesar and Octavius should not be made too sentimental. Roman adoption, inheritance, and advancement were public instruments as well as family acts, and Caesar's attention to his great-nephew belonged to the world of Roman calculation. Caesar had no legitimate son who could carry his name inside the Roman system. Cleopatra had borne Caesarion in Egypt, but Caesarion's position could not solve a Roman succession problem in any ordinary way. Rome did not possess a formal monarchy in which a ruler named his crown prince. Yet great Roman houses did think in terms of name, property, clients, and memory. Caesar needed continuity, even if the form of that continuity had to remain legally Roman rather than royal. Octavius's companions also mattered. Among them, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa stands out with a clarity that grows stronger across the story. Agrippa did not come from the highest aristocracy, but he possessed practical talent of the kind that Roman politics often needed, and aristocratic vanity sometimes underestimated. His friendship with Octavius would become one of the decisive relationships of the age. In later years, Agrippa would command fleets, build harbors, repair infrastructure, hold offices, marry into the ruling family, and serve as the indispensable man behind victories that made Augustus possible. At the beginning, he was part of the small circle around a young heir whose future still depended on decisions made by others. Apollonia, where Octavius was staying when Caesar was killed, placed him in a revealing position. The city lay across the Adriatic in Illyria, and it was being used as a place of education and preparation while Caesar planned a campaign against Parthia. Octavius was studying there, but the setting was not detached from war. Military officers, young aristocrats, Greek teachers, and preparations for Eastern campaigning belonged to the same environment. He was close enough to Caesar's next great project to be included in its outer formation, yet removed from Rome when the assassination occurred. Distance saved him from the immediate dangers of the Ides of March. It also forced him to make his first great decision without the protection of Caesar's living authority. The news from Rome reached Apollonia as more than a report of death. It carried the collapse of a political world Octavius had expected to enter under Caesar's sponsorship. Caesar had been murdered by senators. Antony was alive and consul. The conspirators had claimed liberty. Caesar's veterans and supporters were uncertain. Rome itself was unstable. For a young man of 18, the safest advice would have been to wait, measure the strength of the factions, and avoid making himself the next target of men who had already killed the most powerful Roman alive. Some around him urged caution. His mother, Actium, had reason to fear the danger waiting in Italy. A private inheritance could be accepted in time. A public inheritance might kill him quickly. Then came the knowledge contained in Caesar's will. Octavius had been adopted as Caesar's son and named his principal heir. That fact transformed a young relative into a political claimant. The adoption gave him the name Gaius Julius Caesar, and names in Rome could behave almost like institutions. A name connected a man to clients, veterans, freedmen, legal expectations, household gods, public memory, and ancestral honor. To refuse the adoption would be to preserve safety at the cost of greatness and perhaps even reputation. To accept it would mean taking on Caesar's debts in every sense: financial obligations, public promises, soldiers' hopes, and the anger still burning around the assassination. Octavius chose acceptance. The decision is easy to misunderstand because later history makes it look inevitable, as though the future Augustus merely stepped onto a road already built for him. At the time, it was an act taken with limited resources and immense risk. He did not command Caesar's legions. Antony had Caesar's papers, and official position. The Senate did not trust another Caesar. The assassins had not vanished. Lepidus had troops. Many older men could reasonably assume that the youth from Apollonia might be flattered, delayed, managed, or removed. Octavius's strength lay partly in the fact that he was underestimated by nearly every group whose attention he needed. His return toward Italy was the first movement of a new political life. He did not arrive as emperor, commander, or settled heir to a throne. Rome had no throne for him to inherit. He came as a young man carrying a legal adoption, a famous name, and the obligation to pay Caesar's promised legacies. Money became an immediate problem because Caesar's generosity to the Roman people had strengthened the dead man's memory and placed a burden on the heir who claimed him. If Octavius wished to be Caesar's son in public, he had to behave like Caesar's son in material terms. That meant finding funds, honoring promises, and making the people see continuity rather than a paper claim. Antony's first response helped reveal the contest ahead. He did not treat Octavian as an equal, and in ordinary terms he had no reason to do so. Antony was consul, an experienced commander, a former lieutenant of Caesar, and a man already holding the documents through which Caesar's last acts could be interpreted. Octavian was young, newly arrived, and dependent on a name he had not yet proved worthy to bear. But Antony's dismissiveness created space for Octavian to present himself as the more faithful guardian of Caesar's memory. The rivalry did not begin as a grand ideological division. It began through inheritance, access, money, veterans, documents, and public gestures. Veterans were among the first audience Octavian had to understand. Caesar's soldiers had followed their commander through Gaul and civil war, and their loyalty did not automatically transfer to a boy because a will named him son. Yet the name mattered, and so did the promise of rewards. Octavian began to cultivate them with care, borrowing money where necessary, and attaching himself to Caesar's memory with deliberate persistence. He learned early that Roman power did not sit in one place. It lay in the forum, in the Senate, in army camps, in private houses, in public funerals, in legal tablets, and in the expectations of men who had carried shields for years and wanted the future they believed Caesar had earned for them. Cicero and the senatorial conservatives would soon see Octavian through their own hopes and fears. To them, Antony appeared the more immediate danger because he held office, pushed Caesar's acts to his own advantage, and seemed capable of turning Caesarian power into personal domination. Octavian, by contrast, could appear useful precisely because he seemed incomplete. His name could divide Caesar's followers. His youth could make him dependent. His rivalry with Antony could be encouraged. Cicero would later imagine that the young man could be praised, raised, and guided, a sequence that revealed more about senatorial wishfulness than about Octavian's character. The heir from Velitri had already made one decision that cautious men advised against. He would not be easy to put back into private life. The change from Octavius to Caesar's son was therefore not a single ceremony of identity. It unfolded through travel, reception, borrowing, negotiation, and the testing of faces in Rome. Each group he met measured him differently. Caesar's friends asked whether he could protect the inheritance. Caesar's enemies wondered whether killing one Caesar had created another. Antony watched an inconvenience become a rival. The people saw a youth connected to gifts they had been promised. Veterans saw an uncertain but potentially useful continuation of their old commander's house. Octavian had to become many things at once before he had the security to become any one of them fully. The young heir's greatest early advantage may have been his willingness to move inside forms older than himself. He did not announce a new order. He claimed a father, a name, a will, a duty to the people, and a loyalty to Caesar's memory. These were Roman claims, intelligible even to men who disliked him. Behind them lay ambition, but ambition in Rome needed clothing it could wear in public. Octavian's first political costume was piety. Piety toward an adoptive father, toward promised gifts, toward veterans, toward the murdered Caesar whose funeral had turned death into a public force. That piety could look dutiful, but it also gave him permission to gather power. By the time Octavian stood within Roman politics, the city had already begun to divide its fears between Antony's immediate strength and the unsettling persistence of Caesar's name. The heir from Velitrae had accepted the inheritance, but acceptance was only the beginning of the cost. He still needed recognition, soldiers, money, and a place inside a state where older men meant to use him before he learnt to use them. Caesar's funeral had given him a name alive with anger and memory. Now Cicero, Antony, and the Senate would discover what could happen when a young man entered their quarrel carrying the dead dictator's name as his first weapon. Chapter 3: Caesar's Name and Cicero's Gamble. Octavian entered Roman politics at a moment when the Senate wanted a weapon against Mark Antony but did not want another Caesar. That contradiction shaped nearly everything that followed. Antony was the immediate danger because he held the consulship, controlled Caesar's papers, had influence over Caesarian veterans, and behaved as the man best placed to inherit the dead dictator's political machine. Octavian was dangerous in a different way, because his power was still unfinished. To men who had spent their lives in the Senate, unfinished power could look manageable. Cicero saw the possibility before many others did. He had survived the dictatorship of Caesar with his reputation bruised but not destroyed, and after the Ides of March he hoped briefly that the Republic might still be recovered through senatorial courage and careful speech. Cicero had never been a soldier of the first rank. His weapons were language, law, memory, ridicule, and the Roman habit of turning public judgment into political force. Against Antony, he began to use those weapons with extraordinary intensity. The speeches later known as the Philippics were not merely complaints against a rival. They were an attempt to define Antony before Rome could accept him as Caesar's natural successor. Antony gave Cicero material enough to work with. During the months after Caesar's murder, he used Caesar's documents and intended acts in ways that made opponents suspect forgery, manipulation, and self-interest. He sought provincial command in Cisalpine Gaul, a strategically important region in northern Italy, where legions and geography could make a Roman politician far more than a magistrate. Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins, had been assigned that province and refused to yield it. Antony moved against him, and the dispute over a governorship turned into a test of whether armed Caesarian authority would dominate the Senate so soon after Caesar's death. Octavian's position in this crisis was awkward and useful at once. He claimed Caesar's name, honored Caesar's promises, and gathered support among veterans who had reason to distrust the assassins. Yet he also opposed Antony, the most powerful living Caesarian in Rome. This made him a strange ally for Cicero and the Senate, a Caesar used against Caesar's colleague. Cicero believed, or persuaded himself, that the young man could be elevated for a purpose and then returned to his proper place beneath senatorial authority. It was a revealing hope. Rome's older political class had watched Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and Antony show what armies could do, yet it still imagined that a name and an army might be borrowed without lasting cost. The Senate's treatment of Octavian showed how emergency could bend republican custom while claiming to defend it. He was far below the normal age for high office, but honors and commands came toward him because circumstances required force, and force was what the Senate lacked. Cicero praised him publicly, presenting him as dutiful, promising, and useful to the Republic. Octavian accepted the praise without surrendering the independence it was meant to soften. He understood that senatorial approval gave him legitimacy, while his soldiers gave him leverage. Neither gift had to cancel the other. Around Mutina, the crisis sharpened. Antony besieged Decimus Brutus, and the Senate sent the consuls Aulus Hirtius and Gaius Vibius Pansa, along with Octavian, to oppose him. This arrangement itself carried the discomfort of the age. Decimus Brutus had helped kill Caesar. Octavian was Caesar's adopted son. Hirtius and Pansa were consuls of the Republic, and all of them were now linked by the need to resist Antony. Civil war had made politics so tangled that men could stand on the same side for one campaign while belonging to different futures. A Roman army could march under the language of liberty while depending on the heir of the murdered dictator. The fighting near Forum Gallorum and Mutina did not give the Senate the clean victory it wanted. Antony was checked, and Decimus Brutus was relieved. But the cost was severe. Pansa was wounded and died shortly afterward. Hirtius also died, leaving both consulships vacant. Their deaths changed the balance in a way no speech could easily repair. The Senate had intended to use Octavian as a junior partner under consular authority, but the consuls were gone, and Octavian remained with soldiers who listened to him. Victory had removed Antony from immediate dominance, yet it also removed the men who might have contained Caesar's heir inside a senatorial plan. Cicero's gamble began to look less like strategy and more like an opening he had offered to someone else. He had wanted Octavian's name and troops without Octavian's ambition. He had wanted to divide the Caesarian party without creating a new Caesarian center. In the language of public speeches, the young man could be called a defender of the Republic. In the harder grammar of Roman power, he was a commander with armed men after a campaign in which the Republic's regular magistrates had died. Octavian did not need to declare himself master of the situation. He only had to refuse to disappear. Decimus Brutus, though relieved from Mutina, could not become the center of recovery. He was one of Caesar's assassins, and that fact made him unacceptable to many soldiers whose loyalty still ran through Caesar's memory. His legal claim to Cisalpine Gaul did not carry the emotional force that Octavian's adoption carried. Nor could the Senate easily bind the armies to itself through gratitude alone. Soldiers who had followed commanders through years of upheaval looked for pay, settlement, security, and recognizable leadership. A senatorial decree could authorize a campaign, but it could not warm the bond between a legion and a distant assembly of aristocrats. Octavian's demand for the consulship followed from this altered field. He was still only 19, far below the traditional age, and the request would have been absurd in a calmer republic. The republic was not calm. He sent his soldiers toward Rome, and the Senate discovered that the young man it had honored could now enforce a request of his own. The forms of legality were preserved because forms mattered, but they were being filled by military pressure. Octavian became consul in 43 BC alongside Quintus Pedius, his relative, and the adoption of Caesar was confirmed with public authority. What had begun as a private claim under a will now stood with the state's recognition behind it. The consulship allowed Octavian to shift the moral direction of politics. The assassins of Caesar could now be pursued through law rather than only through memory or anger. A special court was established against Caesar's killers, and the language of vengeance received institutional form. This was one of the decisive turns of the period. Cicero had tried to use Caesar's heir to save the Republic from Antony. Octavian used Republican office to make vengeance for Caesar a public duty. In Rome, legitimacy often came less from inventing new power than from finding an old procedure capable of carrying it. Antony, meanwhile, had not been destroyed. After Mutina, he withdrew and began rebuilding his position among Caesarian forces. Lepidus, who commanded troops and had long belonged to Caesar's circle, became increasingly important as the lines changed. The Senate could denounce Antony, but denunciation mattered only as far as armies obeyed it. In the months after Mutina, the possibility of a senatorial recovery weakened because the men with soldiers had reasons to settle with one another. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus might distrust each other, but they shared more with one another than any of them shared with the assassins or with Cicero's hopes. Cicero's speeches had made Antony a public enemy. Yet they could not make Octavian a permanent servant of the Senate. The old orator understood the power of reputation, and for much of his life that understanding had been enough to raise him, defend him, and bring down others. Now reputation had to compete with legions, confiscations, provincial commands, and the political claims of dead Caesar's name. Cicero was not foolish. He saw much, feared much, and spoke with a courage that deserves its place in the story. But he belonged to a world in which eloquence could still imagine itself as the highest guardian of the state. Octavian belonged to the world that had followed. There was a personal coldness in Octavian's rise that later generations noticed, but in these early months it was also a form of survival. Warm impulse would not have carried him through Antony, the Senate, the assassins, and the veterans. He watched how older men used him, and he learned the price of being useful. Cicero's praise helped him. Antony's contempt helped him. The Senate's fear helped him. Every misjudgment gave him another narrow space in which to move, and he moved through those spaces with a steadiness that made his youth less important with each decision. The alliance that would soon form between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus was not a reconciliation of friendship. It was a recognition of arithmetic. The Caesarian forces divided among them could exhaust one another while Brutus and Cassius gathered strength in the east, or they could combine, legalize their command, seize resources, and avenge Caesar together. For Octavian, such an arrangement would mean standing beside Antony, the man who had tried to diminish him. For Antony, it would mean accepting Caesar's heir as a partner rather than a nuisance. For Lepidus, it would mean preserving a place in a game increasingly dominated by stronger wills. Cicero had hoped to guide events through the Senate, but the center of gravity had moved. The young heir from Velytra had crossed from claimant to consul, from useful youth to armed politician, from Caesar's adopted son to a man capable of forcing Rome to acknowledge him. Mutina had weakened Antony for a moment, yet it had also removed the consuls who stood above Octavian. The Senate had tried to defend the Republic by borrowing Caesar's name. The name did not return quietly when the borrowing was done. A new settlement among the Caesarians now approached, and it would be harsher than the uneasy compromises after the Ides of March. The men who claimed to restore order needed money, soldiers, provinces, and revenge, and Rome had already shown how quickly legality could be made to serve necessity. Cicero's gamble had lifted Octavian into power, but it had not saved Cicero's world. The next arrangement would not depend on senatorial speeches. It would be written in formal authority, posted names, confiscated property, and the terrible public accounting of the proscriptions. Chapter 4. The Second Triumvirate and the Cost of Vengeance. The Second Triumvirate gave Roman vengeance a legal body. It was not a loose friendship among Caesar's heirs and former lieutenants, nor a private understanding between men who happened to command soldiers. In November of 43 BC, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus met near Bononia and arranged power as men arrange territory after deciding that the old referees no longer matter. Soon afterward, a law known as the Lex Titia created a formal commission of 3 men for the restoration of the state. The phrase sounded reassuring, because Rome still preferred public authority to naked seizure, but the authority it created was extraordinary, concentrated, and armed. Octavian entered that arrangement as the youngest and newest of the 3, but no longer as the boy Cicero had hoped to guide. Antony brought reputation, experience, and the memory of service beside Caesar. Lepidus brought rank, troops, and the usefulness of a man whose presence made the new command look broader than a duel between 2 stronger figures. Octavian brought Caesar's name, a consulship recently forced from the Senate, and the knowledge that he could not defeat all his enemies separately. Brutus and Cassius were gathering strength in the east. Antony had not been destroyed after Mutina. Cicero and the senatorial party still spoke as if Octavian might be separated from the Caesarian cause. The young heir had learned that survival required partnership with men he neither trusted nor forgave. The meeting itself became one of those Roman moments in which personal danger and public legality lay close together. Ancient accounts place the negotiations on an island or near a river crossing, with each man guarded and cautious, because none of the three could assume safety in the presence of the others. Antony and Octavian had recently been enemies. Lepidus's role as intermediary did not remove suspicion. They had to decide provinces, commands, money, and the treatment of enemies, while armed followers waited nearby. No one needed to say that a failed negotiation could become another civil war before sunset. The agreement held because each man could count the cost of refusing it. Once formed, the triumvirate possessed powers that made ordinary magistracy look thin. The three men could make laws, appoint magistrates, assign provinces, command armies, and act without waiting for the slow consent of institutions that had already lost control of events. They claimed to be restoring the Republic, but restoration now meant granting emergency power to the very kind of military leaders whose rivalry had broken Republican government. This was the Roman habit at its most revealing. Even revolution preferred to enter the city wearing the clothing of law. A decree, a statute, a title, and a public purpose could make an armed settlement appear as an act of state. Money stood behind much of what followed. Armies had to be paid. Veterans had to be promised land. Officers had to be rewarded. Campaigns against Brutus and Cassius in the east required ships, supplies, and the loyalty of men who would not fight indefinitely on memory alone. Caesar's murder gave the triumvirs a language of vengeance, but vengeance also needed financing. The wealth of enemies offered one solution. Confiscation could fill treasuries, pay soldiers, and remove political opponents in a single administrative motion. That combination made the proscriptions both terrifying and useful. Names began to appear on public lists. A proscribed man could be killed with official approval, his property seized, and rewards offered to those who assisted in his capture. Houses that had belonged to senators, equestrians, and wealthy citizens suddenly became part of the new political economy. Family loyalty, household service, friendship, fear, and greed were all tested by the posting of a name. The older memory of Sulla's proscriptions hung over Rome because the city had seen before how civil conflict could turn public lists into private ruin. Now the practice returned under men who claimed to avenge Caesar and restore order. Cicero's name was among the most important. Antony wanted him dead, and for Antony the matter was not abstract politics. Cicero's Philippics had attacked him in language meant to strip him of dignity, legitimacy, and Roman trust. The orator had tried to make Antony appear as a public enemy before Antony could become the unavoidable heir of Caesarian power. Octavian had benefited from that effort, and this made Cicero's fate colder. The young man whose rise Cicero had encouraged now sat among those who could save or abandon him. In the bargaining of the triumvirate, Cicero was abandoned. Cicero's final hours were remembered because they seemed to close more than one life. He fled from Rome, uncertain whether escape would remain possible, while the machinery of proscription moved behind him. Near Formia, he was overtaken by soldiers. The ancient accounts give him a composure suited to the memory of a man who had lived by public speech, though such accounts often arrange death into moral shape after the fact. He was killed, and his head and hands were taken back to Rome. Antony had them displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform from which Cicero's voice had so often entered public life. The detail endured because it joined the man's body to the instrument of his power. For Octavian, Cicero's death revealed the terms of his alliance with Antony. He could not claim Caesar's vengeance, fight beside Antony, and still preserve the senatorial protector who had tried to use him. The choice did not require cruelty of feeling in every detail. Political necessity was enough. Cicero belonged to the world Octavian was leaving behind, even though Cicero had helped him cross into the next one. The cost was not only the death of an old orator, it was the public demonstration that gratitude would not be allowed to stand against the needs of power. The proscriptions spread fear through the upper ranks of Roman society, but they also rearranged property. Confiscated estates could be sold, assigned, or used to satisfy the demands of war. A man's house, land, slaves, furnishings, and accounts might pass into other hands, because his name had entered a list prepared by the state's new masters. This was not random disorder in the street. It was violence administered through procedure, and that made it more durable than a riot. Clerks, agents, soldiers, informers, buyers, and beneficiaries all had places within the process. The Republic's old social world was not merely frightened, it was being materially redistributed. Lepidus's presence in the Triumvirate should not be dismissed too early. Later history makes him look weak because he eventually lost the contest, but in 43 BC he mattered. He had held high office, commanded forces, and belonged to Caesar's circle of trusted men. His inclusion helped bind additional troops and gave the new regime a wider Caesarian face. Still, the deeper tension ran between Antony and Octavian. Each needed the other against the assassins. Each also knew that Caesar's inheritance could not remain divided forever without producing a later reckoning. The assassins in the east gave the Triumvirate its immediate direction. Brutus and Cassius had left Italy and gathered provinces, money, ships, and military support. They did not see themselves as fugitives from justice, but as defenders of the Republic forced to continue the cause outside Rome. Their control of eastern resources made them dangerous. If they were allowed to consolidate, they could return not as isolated conspirators, but as commanders of a senatorial war. The triumvirs therefore needed to cross the Adriatic and settle the question that Caesar's murder had opened. Before that campaign could begin, Rome had to be secured behind them. The proscriptions removed opponents, raised money, and frightened the hesitant into obedience. Offices could be assigned, provincial arrangements could be made, legions could be directed toward the coming war. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus divided the Roman world in a manner that acknowledged power rather than tradition. Their authority was temporary in theory, but the habits created by temporary emergency often survive their announced purpose. Rome was learning again that a state can become accustomed to extraordinary command when ordinary command has failed. Among ordinary citizens, the proscriptions did not carry one meaning only. Some saw justice for Caesar. Others saw a return of sullen terror. Many likely saw danger and kept close to silence. The urban people who had raged at Caesar's funeral were not the same as the aristocrats whose estates now stood exposed, but the politics of the city joined them uneasily. Caesar's memory could still stir popular feeling, while the practical work of vengeance enriched and empowered those who ruled in his name. A dead man's wounds had become a living government's justification. Octavian's youth remained visible, but it no longer defined him. He had accepted adoption, raised money, gathered veterans, used Cicero's support, forced the consulship, and joined Antony and Lepidus in a legal command over the Roman world. Each step had made the next possible, and each step had moved him farther from the cautious hopes of Otia, the studies at Apollonia, and the uncertain position of a young heir returning to Italy. He had not yet become the careful restorer of later Augustan memory. In these years, he was a civil war leader, learning that mercy, legality, and violence could all be made instruments of the same ascent. Antony, for his part, gained what he needed in the short term. Cicero was gone. The Caesarian cause was unified enough to face the East. His own prestige as soldier and lieutenant of Caesar remained considerable, and he could expect to play the leading role in the campaign ahead. Yet Antony had also accepted Octavian as a partner in vengeance, and that acceptance gave the young Caesar a legitimacy no senatorial decree alone could have provided. The man Antony had once treated as an inconvenience now stood beside him in the highest extraordinary authority Rome could offer. The Second Triumvirate did not restore peace. It organized the next war. Its creation showed that Caesar's death had not revived the Republic. It had forced Caesar's followers to build a harsher legal instrument in his name. The proscriptions paid for armies and settled scores, but they also announced that Rome's political class would no longer be protected by rank, eloquence, or old service if it stood in the path of armed necessity. Cicero's head on the rostra gave the age one of its most severe images, but behind that image lay the larger movement of property, offices, soldiers, and fear. With Rome subdued and the Western arrangements made, the triumvirs could turn toward the men who had struck Caesar down. Across the sea, Brutus and Cassius still held the last great organized hope of the Republican cause. They carried famous names, Eastern money, and the belief that Caesar's murder could still be justified by victory. Antony and Octavian now carried the law of vengeance, the armies of the Caesarean party, and the unsettled partnership that would have to survive battle before it could break apart. The road from the proscriptions led eastward toward Philippi, where the liberators would discover whether killing Caesar had been enough to defeat Caesar's world. Chapter 5: Philippi and the End of the Liberators. Philippi lay far from the Senate house where Caesar had fallen, but the road to it began on the Ides of March. Brutus and Cassius had killed Caesar in Rome, among senators, beneath the language of liberty and ancestral duty. Their cause, however, could not survive on symbolism alone. Once Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had formed the Second Triumvirate, the murder of Caesar became the legal center of a new war, and the men who had called themselves liberators had to defend their act with armies gathered in the east. The eastern provinces gave Brutus and Cassius time, money, and distance. Cassius had long experience in that part of the world, and after Caesar's death he moved with a speed that showed how much power still lived outside Rome itself. Brutus, whose name carried republican memory with unusual force, became the more morally useful face of the cause, while Cassius supplied a harder military intelligence. Cities, client rulers, treasuries, and provincial officers all had to decide how they would answer the men who claimed to have freed Rome. The liberators could speak of the Republic, but they also demanded ships, coin, and obedience, as every Roman commander in civil war had done before them. Antony and Octavian crossed eastward with an army that carried Caesar's vengeance as its public purpose. Lepidus remained in the west, important but no longer central to the immediate campaign. Antony entered Philippi with the greater military authority, and his experience showed in the handling of the field. Octavian was present as Caesar's son and triumvir, though illness again shadowed him at a crucial point. That physical frailty mattered less than his symbolic position. Even when he could not dominate the battlefield by personal command, his name gave the campaign its deepest political charge. The ground around Philippi shaped the fighting before the fighting itself was decided. Brutus and Cassius held strong positions, with camps set against difficult terrain and supply routes reaching toward the sea. Antony and Octavian needed to force decision before time and resources favored their opponents. In a civil war, delay could become a weapon, because every week tested money, grain, morale, and the loyalty of allies who preferred to support the side that looked more likely to endure. The campaign, therefore, was not only a meeting of legions. It was a contest over whether Caesar's murder would harden into a restored senatorial cause or be answered by the organized force of his heirs. The first major clash at Philippi produced a result that was almost divided in two. Brutus's forces pushed successfully against Octavian's side and even overran his camp, a fact that later stories remembered with interest because the future Augustus might easily have been captured or killed. Octavian himself was not in the camp at the decisive moment, reportedly because of illness or a warning dream passed through his circle. Antony, meanwhile, struck Cassius's forces with greater success. The field did not deliver one clear verdict at once. One wing of the Republican cause had reason to think victory possible, while the other had begun to fail. Cassius's death gave the battle its first irreversible turn. Believing the situation lost and unable to see clearly that Brutus had succeeded elsewhere, he ordered his own death. The irony was remembered because misread information, distance, and the confusion of battle had changed the fate of one of the conspiracy's sharpest minds. Cassius had helped plan Caesar's murder and had understood power with fewer illusions than many around him. Yet, at Philippi he died before the full result of the day could be known. A commander who had moved so skillfully across the east was undone, not by a completed defeat, but by the fog of a partial one. Brutus remained, and for a short time the Republican cause still had its most famous name. His situation, though, had narrowed. Cassius had been the more seasoned military partner, and the armies under Brutus now carried victory and loss together, an unstable mixture for any commander. Antony and Octavian also had difficulties, but their cause could absorb strain through the stronger emotional unity of vengeance for Caesar and through the practical necessity that bound their men together. Brutus's soldiers had fought well, yet the death of Cassius removed one of the main supports beneath the whole Eastern coalition. Between the two battles, the pressure on Brutus increased. Supplies mattered. Morale mattered. The willingness of officers to wait mattered. Some of Brutus's men wanted action, and a commander in civil war could not always choose patience when his own army doubted the cost of delay. Antony and Octavian needed another decision, and Brutus was drawn toward giving it. Ancient accounts preserve arguments over whether he should have waited longer, but the question itself shows the difficulty of his position. Delay may have helped the Republican side strategically, while impatience inside the army made delay harder to sustain. The second battle ended the cause that had begun with Caesar's assassination. Brutus's forces were defeated, and Brutus himself fled with a small circle before taking his own life. The physical details need not be lingered over. What mattered to Rome was the removal of the last figure whose name could join the murder of Caesar to an older story of liberation. Brutus had not been just another conspirator. His ancestry, reputation, philosophical friendships, and public image gave the assassination a moral frame that Cassius alone could not have supplied. When Brutus died, that frame did not disappear from memory, but it lost its army. Antony treated Brutus's body with a measure of respect, a detail ancient writers noticed because civil war so often denied dignity to the defeated. Octavian's remembered conduct appears harsher in some traditions, though accounts of these years are shaped by later judgment and political storytelling. The contrast mattered because Antony emerged from Philippi with military prestige strengthened. He had fought effectively, decided much of the campaign, and appeared as the senior commander among Caesar's avengers. Octavian, by comparison, had survived, remained legitimate, and continued to carry Caesar's name, but he had not yet shown the commandability that later victory would require from others on his behalf. Philippi settled the fate of the liberators, but it did not settle Rome. The defeat of Brutus and Cassius removed the most organized Republican military opposition, leaving the victors to divide the world among themselves. Antony received the East, where wealth, client kings, old Hellenistic courts, and future campaigns offered the stage most suited to his gifts and appetites. Octavian took on Italy and the West, including the brutal task of satisfying veterans whose service had to be paid in land. Lepidus remained part of the arrangement, but his share stood increasingly below the rivalry forming between the other two. Victory had reduced the number of players without reducing the causes of conflict. For Octavian, Italy was both prize and burden. Soldiers expected settlement, and promises made in war became claims pressed upon towns and farms. Veterans did not want abstractions about liberty or legality. They wanted the rewards commanders had used to secure their loyalty. Land had to come from somewhere, and in Italy that meant communities would feel the cost of civil war even after the battlefield moved away. The young Caesar's authority would now be tested not by speeches in the Senate or by symbolic inheritance alone, but by surveyors, confiscations, angry towns, and the resentment of citizens displaced to fulfill military obligations. Antony's eastern assignment gave him a different kind of advantage. He could collect money, reorganize provinces, negotiate with rulers, and step into a world where Roman command blended with older royal forms. His prestige after Philippi made him appear the stronger man, and many observers could reasonably have expected the future to belong to him. Octavian had Caesar's name, but Antony had the record of command. The difference between them after Philippi was not yet the difference between a doomed romantic and a destined emperor. It was the difference between an experienced soldier at the height of his reputation and a young politician whose most difficult work had only begun. The deaths of Brutus and Cassius also changed the moral language of Roman politics. The cause of the assassins could still be admired by some, mourned by others, and debated by writers long after the armies were gone. In practical terms, however, the Republic no longer had a great field army fighting openly under its name. Opposition to the triumvirs would continue, but it would take different forms through local resistance, senatorial unease, personal rivalry, and later the conflict between the two strongest heirs of Caesar's world. The old question of whether Caesar should have been killed gave way to a more immediate question: which Caesarian would command the peace his death had failed to bring? Philippi's human cost also followed the victors home. Legions that had fought there did not dissolve into gratitude. They became claimants. Officers expected reward, and ordinary soldiers expected the settlement that years of violence had taught them to demand. The Republic had long depended on citizen soldiers who returned to civic life, but the late Republic had created armies whose loyalty ran through commanders and promises. After Philippi, those promises came due with a force that no constitutional speech could soften. Octavian's next battlefield would be Italy itself, where Roman victory abroad meant Roman dispossession at home. In memory, Philippi often appears as the end of the liberators, and that is true as far as Brutus and Cassius are concerned. Yet for the story of Augustus, it is also the beginning of a harsher education. Octavian learned that victory could leave the victor with obligations more dangerous than defeat. He learned that Antony's prestige would not vanish through shared success. He learned that Caesar's name could avenge the dead, but could not feed soldiers or settle land without creating new enemies. The young heir had survived the Eastern War, and survival was still his most reliable talent. The road from Philippi therefore leads not into peace, but into Italy's fields and towns. Caesar's assassins were gone, but Caesar's veterans remained, and the men who had promised them reward now had to make those promises visible in soil, boundaries, and houses. Antony moved eastward into a larger and richer world. Octavian returned westward into a narrower and more bitter task. The Republic's liberators had fallen at Philippi, but the cost of the Caesarian victory was about to be collected from Italy. Chapter 6: Italy, Land, and the War at Perugia. Italy received the victory at Philippi not as a distant piece of news, but as a demand written into land. The armies that had followed Octavian and Antony against Brutus and Cassius expected settlement, and those expectations could not be satisfied by speeches, decrees, or public gratitude alone. Veterans wanted farms, security, and visible payment for years spent under arms. Commanders had promised those rewards because promises kept soldiers loyal. Once the liberators were defeated, the promises had to be redeemed in Italian soil. Octavian carried the burden of that redemption more heavily than Antony. Antony had gone east, where provinces, kings, and treasuries offered a wider field for command. Octavian remained in Italy, where every grant to a veteran could mean the loss of land for an existing owner. The task was practical before it was ideological. Surveyors had to mark boundaries. Commissioners had to assign plots. Towns had to learn whether their territory would be taken for settlement. Families who had supported the wrong side or simply lived in the wrong place found that the consequences of civil war could arrive after the battle had already ended. Land confiscation had a long Roman history, but the scale and political temperature after Philippi made it especially bitter. Soldiers who had fought for Caesar's heirs did not see themselves as thieves. They saw themselves as men owed payment by commanders whose survival depended on them. Dispossessed Italians did not usually see themselves as enemies of Rome. Many had farms, local ties, graves of ancestors, and property claims that predated the latest war. Between those two understandings stood Octavian, still young, still building authority, and now required to make one form of loyalty answerable to another. The towns affected by confiscation did not all suffer in the same way. Some communities were punished more severely because their land was desirable, politically vulnerable, or administratively convenient. Cremona, Mantua, and other northern Italian districts entered later memory because their fields were touched by veteran settlement. The poet Virgil, born near Mantua, would later stand in Roman literary memory close to this world of dispossession and restoration, though the details of his own land story are difficult to separate from biography, poetry, and later interpretation. What remains clear is the atmosphere of uncertainty created by grants, appeals, exemptions, and reversals. Land was not an abstraction in Italy. It was measured ground, income, inheritance, and the visible sign of belonging. Into this resentment stepped Fulvia and Lucius Antonius. Fulvia, Antony's wife, was no silent domestic figure at the edge of events. Ancient writers often treated politically active women with suspicion, and their portraits of her carry the sharpness of that discomfort. But her presence in the crisis cannot be ignored. Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, held the consulship in 41 BC, giving the Antonian cause an official Roman voice inside Italy. Together, they became centers around which opposition to Octavian's land settlements could gather. Their motives were not simple. They could speak for injured Italians, defend Antony's interests, and weaken Octavian at the same time. Lucius Antonius presented himself in terms that reached beyond family rivalry. He claimed to defend liberty and oppose the domination of the triumvirs, even though his own brother was one of them. Such language had become both meaningful and flexible in the civil wars. Men could invoke the Republic while pursuing factional advantage. They could condemn extraordinary power while benefiting from it through another connection. Lucius's challenge placed Octavian in an uncomfortable position, because the grievance against land confiscation was real even when it was used by political rivals. A young leader trying to satisfy veterans now appeared to many Italians as the face of dispossession. Fulvia's role sharpened the personal edge of the conflict. She had been married before to Publius Clodius Pulcher, whose violent political career had once shaken Rome, and later to Curio, another figure of Caesarian politics, before becoming Antony's wife. Through these marriages, she stood at the intersection of several turbulent political networks. Sources hostile to her remembered her as forceful, ambitious, and unwomanly by Roman standards, terms that reveal as much about Roman expectations as about Fulvia herself. Her involvement in the Parisine crisis suggests that Antony's absence in the East did not leave his interests undefended in Italy. It also gave Octavian's supporters a target through which they could make the conflict look like disorder stirred by Antony's household. Perugia became the place where scattered grievance hardened into siege. Lucius Antonius and his supporters entered the city, and Octavian's forces surrounded it. The town stood on a strong hill in Etruria, with walls and elevation that made it defensible. But strength of position did not solve the problem of supply. Siege changed politics into endurance. Inside the walls, Lucius's cause depended on food, discipline, and hope that relief would come. Outside, Octavian had to maintain pressure without allowing the conflict to widen into a full reunion of Antony's forces against him. Antony himself remained away, and that absence shaped the whole crisis. His lieutenants in the west did not move with the unity or urgency that Lucius needed. Some may have hesitated because Antony's own intentions were unclear. Others may have judged the balance of risk too carefully to commit themselves fully. For Lucius inside Perugia, the difference between political claim and military support became increasingly severe. A cause could gather words, names, and resentments, but a besieged city required grain and armed relief. Without them, even a consul's authority narrowed behind the walls that protected him. The winter siege of Perugia was remembered as harsh, and the memory was later darkened by stories of punishment and sacrifice that are difficult to handle with certainty. What can be stated with confidence is that the city surrendered after hunger and pressure made continued resistance impossible. Lucius Antonius was spared, a choice that served Octavian's political needs, because killing Antony's brother might have made reconciliation with Antony impossible. Fulvia escaped the immediate settlement, but died soon afterward in Greece, before the next arrangement between Octavian and Antony took final shape. Many lesser men did not receive the same mercy, and Perugia entered Roman memory as a warning about the cost of standing between triumviral power and military necessity. Octavian's conduct after the surrender has been judged severely in some ancient accounts, especially through reports of executions among local leaders and opponents. The exact details are disputed, shaped by hostile tradition and later moral interpretation, but the political result is plain enough. He emerged stronger in Italy, while the Antonian challenge within the peninsula failed. The victory did not make him loved, it made him harder to dislodge. Civil war often rewards the leader who can survive hatred long enough for later order to soften its memory. The land issue, however, did not disappear with Perugia. Veterans still required settlement. Italian communities still carried the marks of confiscation. Antony's supporters still had reason to suspect Octavian's intentions, and Octavian had reason to distrust any Antonian network remaining in the West. The conflict had shown that Italy itself, the heartland from which Roman legitimacy drew so much of its strength, could be treated as the payment ground for armies. That fact would echo beyond the immediate crisis. A regime that promised peace would later have to show that it could stop making Italy pay for every victory. Perugia also changed the relationship between Octavian and Antony by forcing both men toward a new agreement. Fulvia's death removed one source of personal and political friction. Antony's return to the West raised the possibility of renewed conflict, but neither side was ready for a decisive war against the other while Sextus Pompey still threatened the sea, and while the Caesarean settlement remained unfinished. The two rivals had fought indirectly through family, followers, and Italian grievances. Now they needed a public repair that would make continued partnership possible, or at least make open rupture less immediate. That repair came through negotiation and marriage. The Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC redistributed the Roman world more clearly between the two strongest triumvirs. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, and Lepidus was left with Africa, still present but increasingly secondary. To seal the arrangement, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman whose reputation for dignity and restraint would later make the failure of the marriage politically useful to Octavian. For the moment, the marriage promised kinship where trust was lacking. Roman politics often used women of elite houses as bridges between men whose ambitions could not otherwise meet safely. Italy could breathe more easily after the immediate crisis, but the peace remained conditional. The veterans had not vanished. The confiscated lands had not returned in any simple pattern. Sextus Pompey still controlled Sicily and threatened Rome's grain supply. Antony's eastern future would soon draw him toward Cleopatra and the politics of kingdoms older than Roman rule. Octavian had learned from Perugia that his position in the West rested not only on Caesar's name, but on the ability to master Italy's anger, reward soldiers, and survive accusations made in the language of liberty. The young Caesar who emerged from the Parisine War was more formidable than the heir who had returned from Apollonia. He had faced Antony's family network, a consul in arms, Italian resentment, and the brutal arithmetic of veteran settlement. He had not solved the moral problem of confiscation. He had shown that he could endure its political cost. That distinction mattered in the years ahead, because Augustus would later be praised as the bringer of peace, while Octavian first had to pass through the rougher work by which peace was made believable to exhausted men. Perugia left behind a lesson that Octavian did not forget. Rome could forgive much if order followed, but order had to become visible in grain, land, law, and the absence of immediate fear. Antony, meanwhile, was turning eastward into a world of wealth, royal courts, and older forms of monarchy, while Octavian remained tied to Italy, veterans, and the difficult business of appearing Roman in the traditional sense. The partnership survived, but it no longer rested on shared vengeance against Caesar's killers. It rested on division, marriage, calculation, and the hope that each man's half of the Roman world would keep him satisfied. That hope would not hold forever. Antony's eastern command offered him resources and grandeur that Italy could not match, and Octavian's western position gave him control over Rome's political memory. Between them stood Octavia, the marriage alliance meant to soften rivalry into family. Beyond her stood Cleopatra of Egypt, whose kingdom, wealth, and relationship with Antony would slowly give Octavian a new language of accusation. The war at Perugia had shown how Roman conflict could grow from land and veterans. The next stage would show how it could grow from geography, marriage, and the fear that a Roman commander in the east might begin to look too much like a king. Chapter 7. Antony in the east, Octavian in the west. Antony's return to the east gave him the richer half of the Roman world, but richness came with a different kind of danger. The eastern Mediterranean had cities older than Rome's power, kingdoms accustomed to ceremony, and rulers who understood diplomacy through courts, gifts, titles, and dynastic display. Antony could raise money there, settle provinces, negotiate with client kings, and plan campaigns that might repair the Roman memory of Crassus's disaster against Parthia. He also entered a political atmosphere in which Roman command could begin to look less like magistracy and more like kingship. Octavian, remaining in the west, would later make that difference into one of his sharpest weapons. The Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC had divided responsibility with the appearance of balance. Antony held the east. Octavian held the west. Lepidus retained Africa, still honored in the structure of the Triumvirate, but increasingly distant from the central rivalry. The agreement did not remove mistrust. It gave mistrust a map. Antony and Octavian could avoid immediate war because each had a sphere large enough to occupy him, while the Roman people could be told that the Caesarian leaders had restored cooperation after the bitterness of Perugia. The state remained divided, yet division could be described as order when men were tired enough of open conflict. Octavia's marriage to Antony stood at the center of this repair. She was Octavian's sister, recently widowed, and remembered by ancient writers as dignified, restrained, and loyal in a world that rewarded none of those qualities reliably. The marriage joined the two strongest houses of the Caesarian settlement, and for a time it gave public form to reconciliation. Antony's connection to Octavian was no longer only political. It passed through a woman whose conduct could be praised even by those who disliked the men around her. Roman aristocratic marriage often carried this burden. A private household became the visible seam between rival ambitions. The marriage mattered because trust was absent. Antony had reason to resent Octavian's conduct in Italy and to distrust his growing control over the West. Octavian had reason to fear Antony's military reputation, his popularity with soldiers, and his command over wealthy eastern provinces. Octavia could not erase those facts, but her presence made rupture harder to present as necessary. For Antony to break with Octavian would also mean damaging a marriage that Rome had been invited to view as a pledge of concord. For Octavian, his sister's position gave him a personal claim within Antony's conduct. Politics had acquired a domestic witness. Antony's eastern responsibilities were not imaginary luxuries. He had real work to do. The region still carried the unsettled consequences of Roman civil wars, local rivalries, Parthian pressure, and the competing needs of client kings. Roman power in the East often depended on arrangements made with rulers who kept their thrones by acknowledging Roman supremacy. These kings supplied money, troops, and local knowledge. In return, they received recognition, protection, and the ability to rule beneath the shadow of Roman arms. Antony was not merely enjoying Eastern grandeur. He was operating inside a system Rome had used for generations, though his style made that system easier to criticize. Cleopatra VII of Egypt belonged to that system, but she also stood apart from it. Egypt was not a minor client kingdom. It was wealthy, ancient, and strategically vital, with grain, treasure, ships, and a court whose traditions reached back through the Ptolemies to Alexander's world. Cleopatra had already known Julius Caesar, had borne a son called Caesarion, and had survived the dangerous years after Caesar's assassination with her throne intact. She was a ruler of unusual intelligence, educated in the languages and politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, and she understood that Rome's civil wars could threaten Egypt or protect it, depending on which Roman she could bind to her interests. Antony first met Cleopatra earlier at Tarsus in 41 BC, when he summoned Eastern rulers to account for their conduct during the recent wars. The meeting became famous because later writers loved its theatrical surface, but beneath the decoration lay serious negotiation. Cleopatra needed security for Egypt and recognition for her own position. Antony needed money, supplies, and a stable Eastern base. Their relationship became personal, but it was never only personal. A Roman commander with Eastern ambitions and an Egyptian queen guarding a rich kingdom had reasons to draw near each other before affection or legend entered the story. Octavian's world in the West looked different. He had Italy, Rome, veterans, and the harder task of appearing as the guardian of Roman order after years of confiscation and civil strife. The West did not offer the same royal spectacle. Its power lay in the capital, the armies, the memory of Caesar, and the ability to shape how Romans understood events elsewhere. Octavian's command of Italy meant command of proximity. He was near the Senate, near the people, near the old temples and public spaces where legitimacy still had to be performed. Antony could possess wealth and fame abroad, but Octavian stood closer to the place where Roman reputation was made. This contrast slowly became political material. Antony in the East could be described as generous, expansive, and royal in bearing by those who admired him. The same traits could be turned against him by enemies. Octavian's supporters could suggest that Antony was becoming less Roman, too dependent on Cleopatra, too comfortable among monarchs, too willing to distribute territories as if the Roman world were part of an Eastern court. Such accusations did not need to be fair in every detail to be useful. Roman political language had long feared kingship, and Antony's Eastern life gave Octavian images through which that fear could be stirred. The Parthian question added another layer. Rome had not forgotten Carrhae, where Crassus had been defeated in 53 BC and Roman standards had been lost. A successful Eastern campaign could have made Antony the restorer of Roman honor and perhaps the greatest soldier of his generation. In 36 BC, he launched a major campaign against Parthia through Armenia, but the operation failed to achieve the decisive result he needed. The losses were heavy, the retreat difficult, and the glory incomplete. Antony survived the failure, but failure in the East made his dependence on Cleopatra's resources and support more visible. Octavian was facing his own crisis at sea against Sextus Pompey, and he needed Antony's cooperation at moments when cooperation was never simple. Meetings between the two men tried to renew the partnership, including the agreement at Tarentum in 37 BC. Octavia played a role in easing relations, helping secure ships from Antony for Octavian and troops promised in return. The details of delivery and obligation became another field of suspicion. Each man believed the other gave too little, too late, or with too much calculation. Their alliance survived through negotiation, but every renewal revealed that renewal was necessary. Octavia's position became increasingly painful. She bore Antony children and remained associated with the Roman form of his alliance, while Cleopatra remained central to his Eastern life. When Octavia later attempted to join Antony with supplies and support, he refused or avoided receiving her in the manner expected of a husband, and this gave Octavian a powerful moral advantage. He did not need to invent his sister's dignity. He could display it against Antony's conduct. A private slight became public evidence, and Roman audiences were ready to understand political betrayal through household failure. Cleopatra's children by Antony made the Eastern arrangement still more vulnerable to Roman suspicion. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus carried names filled with dynastic memory, and Antony's recognition of them linked Roman power to Ptolemaic ambition. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, made the matter sharper because his existence touched Caesar's legacy directly. Octavian's whole authority rested on adoption by Caesar. Caesarion's blood claim, though politically difficult in Rome, could not be ignored as a symbolic threat. The more Antony's world gathered around Cleopatra's court, the easier it became for Octavian to present his rival as a man endangering Roman inheritance itself. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BC gave Octavian the clearest material. In a public ceremony after Antony's Armenian success, territories and titles were assigned to Cleopatra and her children, with Caesarion honored in terms that connected him to Caesar. To Antony and Cleopatra, the ceremony could be understood as an Eastern settlement, using dynastic forms familiar in that region. To Roman critics, it looked like a Roman commander distributing Roman possessions under the influence of an Egyptian queen. The visual language mattered. Thrones, children, titles, royal dress, and Alexandria rather than Rome. Octavian could turn that ceremony into a political indictment. Antony's defenders could answer that Rome had long worked through client kings and that Eastern monarchy did not automatically mean betrayal. They could point to Octavian's own ruthlessness in Italy, the proscriptions, Perugia, and the ambitions hidden beneath his language of order. None of that was false. Yet political success does not require purity. It requires a story that enough people find usable. Octavian's story became increasingly simple in public shape. He stood for Italy, Rome, Caesar's lawful adoption, and the defense of Roman custom against a commander who had placed himself in Cleopatra's world. The simplification was powerful because it rested on visible fragments of truth. Antony's mistake was not that he cared for Cleopatra, if care is even the right word for a relationship so bound to power. His danger lay in allowing his political center to become legible outside Rome in forms Romans could be taught to distrust. He needed the East, and Cleopatra was one of the East's greatest resources. He needed money, ships, and dynastic settlement, and Egypt could provide them. Yet every advantage carried an image Octavian could use. Gold could be called corruption. Royal alliance could be called enslavement. Eastern ceremony could be called abandonment of Rome. Octavian's western position also changed as Sextus Pompey was defeated and Lepidus was pushed aside. With the West more secure, he could spend more attention shaping the coming confrontation. He did not have Antony's battlefield glamour, but he had Agrippa, Italy, Caesar's name, and patience. He also had the advantage of making the next war appear less like another civil war. If Antony could be tied in public imagination to Cleopatra, then Octavian could claim that Rome was not fighting Rome. Rome was defending itself from an Eastern queen and the Roman who had fallen under her influence. The partnership between Antony and Octavian therefore decayed before it formally broke. Its first bond had been vengeance for Caesar. Its second had been division of the Roman world. Its third had been marriage through Octavia. One by one, each bond weakened. Caesar's assassins were gone. Division became rivalry. Marriage became evidence against Antony rather than protection for him. Cleopatra, Egypt, and the donations of Alexandria gave Octavian a language strong enough to gather fear, patriotism, and personal grievance into one accusation. Yet before Antony could be confronted fully, Octavian had to complete his control of the West. The greatest immediate obstacle was not in Alexandria, but in Sicily, where Sextus Pompey held the grain routes on which Rome depended. Hunger could humble any ruler of the capital, and Sextus knew that a city fed by sea could be pressured by ships more effectively than by speeches. Antony's eastern grandeur would matter later. First, Octavian had to show that he could feed Rome, defeat Pompey's son, and remove Lepidus from the center of power. The struggle for empire would pass through bread before it returned to Egypt. Chapter 8. Sextus Pompey and the Hunger of Rome. Sextus Pompey troubled Octavian in a way no speech in the Senate could solve. He did not hold Rome, and he did not claim Caesar's inheritance, but he controlled the sea lanes by which Rome was fed. Sicily, Sardinia, and the surrounding waters mattered because the capital could not live on dignity, memory, or decrees. Grain came by ship. When those ships were delayed, captured, threatened, or redirected, politics entered the stomach before it entered argument. A hungry city did not ask whether a blockade respected constitutional theory. Sextus carried a name almost as powerful in its own way as Caesar's. He was the son of Pompey the Great, Caesar's defeated rival, and that inheritance gave him an appeal to men who had lost under Caesar and later under the triumvirs. After Pompey's death in Egypt and the defeat of the remaining Pompeian forces, Sextus continued the family cause from the sea. He gathered ships, fugitives, proscribed men, freedmen, and others who found in his command either political refuge or practical employment. His fleet made him hard to reach. His position in Sicily made him impossible to ignore. Rome's dependence on grain gave Sextus leverage over every man who wished to govern it. The city had grown far beyond what nearby fields could reliably supply, and its food system rested on regular movement from grain-producing regions across the Mediterranean. Sicily had fed Rome for generations. Africa and Egypt also mattered greatly, but Sicily's closeness made it immediate. A commander based there could pressure the capital without marching through Italy. He could make shortage feel like political failure. Octavian, who was trying to present himself as the bringer of order in the West, could not allow another man to make Rome's bread uncertain. The people of Rome had already lived through years of fear, confiscation, rumor, and civil conflict. Hunger added a different strain. A crowd angry over food did not behave like a Senate debating provincial commands. It judged power by whether markets filled and distributions arrived. Sextus understood this, and so did Octavian. The struggle against him was therefore not only a naval campaign, it was a contest over credibility in the capital. If Octavian could not secure the grain routes, Antony's eastern wealth and reputation would not be his only problem. Rome itself might begin to doubt the value of his rule. For a time, negotiation seemed easier than decisive war. The Pact of Misenum in 39 BC recognized Sextus in a temporary settlement, granting him control over Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Peloponnese, while promising consulship and restoration for some of his followers. In return, Sextus was to allow grain shipments to resume and end the pressure on Italy. The agreement brought relief, but it did not bring trust. To the triumvirs, Sextus remained a rebel with ships. To Sextus, the triumvirs remained men who had proscribed citizens, seized lands, and built power through Caesar's vengeance. Peace existed on the surface because all sides needed time. The banquet associated with the Pact of Misenum became famous in later memory because it seemed to place the whole instability of the age on a single floating platform. Ancient writers tell that Sextus entertained Antony and Octavian aboard his ship, while his admiral Manus urged him to cut the anchor cables and seize the guests, which would have left the Roman world leaderless in an instant. Sextus refused, saying in effect that Manus should have done it without telling him. Whether the exchange is polished by later storytelling or not, the story survived because it expressed a truth about the moment. Men who claimed to settle the world could still be at the mercy of one ship, one decision, and one subordinate's suggestion. The pact soon weakened. Promises were disputed. Territories changed hands, and the old suspicions returned. Octavian suffered badly in early naval efforts against Sextus, because command at sea required knowledge different from command on land. Ships had to be built and equipped. Crews had to be trained to move together. Harbors had to protect vessels from weather and enemy attack. Naval war punished improvisation. Sextus had experience, bases, and commanders who understood the sea. Octavian had political need, but political need did not by itself produce seamanship. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa became the answer to that deficiency. His importance in Octavian's life is difficult to overstate, because again and again he supplied practical competence where Octavian's own gifts were political rather than technical. Agrippa was not merely a loyal friend placed in command as a gesture of trust. He was an organizer, engineer, soldier, and administrator, able to turn strategic need into workable systems. Against Sextus, this meant preparing for sea power in a disciplined and material way. The coming victory would belong to Octavian politically, but it would be made possible by Agrippa's hands and judgment. Agrippa created a training base by connecting the Lucrine Lake and Lake Avernus near the Bay of Naples, forming the harbor known as Portus Julius. The choice showed his habit of solving a military problem through construction before battle. Ships could be sheltered there. Crews could train away from immediate enemy pressure. Rowers and marines could learn the repeated motions on which naval combat depended. War at sea was not a matter of courage alone. It required timber, rope, oars, ramps, towers, pilots, signals, and long practice in making many bodies obey one command across moving water. A technical device associated with Agrippa, the harpax, also entered the campaign. It was a grappling apparatus, an improvement on earlier boarding methods, designed to catch enemy ships and allow Roman marines to bring the fight close. The detail matters because Roman naval success often came from finding ways to make sea fighting resemble land fighting. Roman soldiers were most comfortable when they could close, board, and turn a vessel into a small battlefield. Agrippa's preparation recognized both the limits and the strengths of his forces. He did not ask Roman crews to become something else overnight. He gave them a method that suited what they could learn to do. Before the final success, Octavian's side endured failure and weather damage. Fleets in the ancient Mediterranean could be undone by storms as much as by enemy action, and ships lost to rough water could not be replaced by confidence. Sextus benefited from every delay because his reputation rested on command of the sea. Octavian's frustration grew as campaigns faltered, but Agrippa's steady preparation changed the balance. The West was being trained into a naval power capable of challenging the Pompeian hold on Sicily. When the next decisive movement came, it came with more than hope behind it. The campaign of 36 BC brought the issue to its end. Agrippa defeated Sextus's forces at Mylae and then, more decisively, at Naulochus. The battle near Nolocus was not simply another engagement in a long civil war. It broke the naval structure that had allowed Sextus to pressure Rome and bargain with the triumvirs. Sextus escaped for a time, but his Sicilian power was finished. Without the fleet and the island base, Pompey's son no longer possessed the same political weight. A famous name could sustain a cause only while ships, men, and supplies gave it body. Octavian's personal performance during these operations did not create the victory in the way later imperial honor might suggest. Agrippa deserved the military credit, and ancient evidence allows that distinction to remain visible. Yet Octavian benefited from choosing, trusting, and retaining a man whose gifts complemented his own. This was one of his greatest political strengths. He did not need to be the best general if he could bind the best general to himself. Agrippa's victories became Octavian's power because loyalty converted talent into regime building. Lepidus then made his last attempt to matter at the center of events. He had brought forces into Sicily and expected a share in the settlement after Sextus's defeat. Instead, the situation turned against him. Octavian appealed to Lepidus's soldiers, and they shifted away from their commander. Lepidus was stripped of his triumviral authority and removed from meaningful political power, though he was allowed to live and retained the office of Pontifex Maximus until his death. The result reduced the Roman world from 3 rulers to 2. Antony and Octavian remained, and the disappearance of Lepidus from the real contest made the coming rivalry clearer. The removal of Lepidus also showed Octavian's ability to win without always destroying. Lepidus was humiliated, but not killed. His survival served a purpose, because it allowed Octavian to appear controlled after victory, especially when compared with the terror of earlier years. In practical terms, Lepidus no longer threatened him. In symbolic terms, sparing him helped Octavian's image as a man moving away from the raw violence of the triumviral beginning. The young Caesar had learned that mercy could be useful once danger had been neutralized. Rome felt the defeat of Sextus through the return of security to its food supply. Grain routes could open. The immediate anxiety created by Sicily's hostile fleet receded. Octavian could claim to have saved the city from hunger, and this claim mattered in a way that constitutional language alone never could. Public order begins with ordinary provisions. Bread in Rome was not merely food. It was evidence that the ruler of the West could make daily life continue. Against Antony's grandeur in the East, Octavian now had a Western achievement that touched the capital directly. Sextus Pompey's fate after his defeat was bleak, though the end came away from the main stage. He fled eastward and was eventually captured and killed by forces connected to Antony's sphere. His death removed the last active son of Pompey the Great from the struggle, closing another line of the civil wars that had begun before Caesar's dictatorship. Pompey's name had once stood against Caesar's. Under Sextus, it had survived at sea, attached to refuge, blockade, and resistance to the triumvirs. After Nolocus, that name no longer commanded fleets. The victory transformed Octavian's position. He controlled the West more securely, had removed Sextus, had pushed aside Lepidus, and had shown Rome that he could solve the grain crisis. His reputation still carried the stain of proscriptions, confiscations, and Perugia, but political memory can be altered by relief. A city that eats again listens differently. Veterans, senators, equestrians, merchants, and ordinary citizens could all understand the value of a safer sea. Octavian's power became less dependent on Caesar's death alone and more connected to the visible restoration of order. Antony remained the larger figure in some imaginations, the commander of the East, the partner of Cleopatra, the man associated with royal courts, Eastern wealth, and the possibility of Parthian glory. But after Sextus's defeat, Octavian could face him from a stronger foundation. He no longer had to worry that Sicily would starve Rome into unrest while Antony gathered prestige abroad. He had Agrippa, Italy, the western provinces, Caesar's name, and a public achievement that could be described as rescue rather than ambition. The balance between the two men had shifted without a formal break. Nolocus therefore stands as more than a naval victory. It marks the moment when Octavian's Western command became durable enough to make the final conflict possible. Sextus Pompey had forced him to learn the politics of hunger, the mechanics of naval preparation, and the usefulness of Agrippa's genius. Lepidus's fall simplified the Roman world into two great centers of power. One lay in the west, close to Rome, presenting itself as order restored. The other lay in the east, rich, theatrical, and increasingly tied to Cleopatra. With Sicily quieted and the grain routes secured, Octavian could turn his full attention toward Antony, and the last war of the Roman Republic began to take shape long before the fleets gathered at Actium. Chapter 9. Actium and the fall of Antony and Cleopatra. Actium did not begin with the fleets that later gave the place its name in Roman memory. It began with years of accusation, distance, and political translation. Antony had become too eastern for Octavian's purposes, and Cleopatra had become too useful as the face of the danger Rome was being asked to fear. A war openly declared against Antony would have looked like another Roman civil war, and Rome had already been asked to bury too many of those beneath noble words. A war declared against Cleopatra could be presented differently. It could look like Italy defending itself against a foreign queen, even while every informed Roman understood that Antony stood at the center of the conflict. Octavian's campaign against Antony therefore moved first through language. The donations of Alexandria had given him a ceremony to describe, and he described it in the most Romanly damaging terms available. Antony could be made to appear as a man distributing Roman power among Cleopatra's children, recognizing Caesarion in ways that threatened Octavian's claim to Caesar, and allowing Alexandria to replace Rome as the stage of command. The reality was more tangled than the accusation, because Rome had long used client kings, eastern settlements, and dynastic arrangements when they served Roman interests. But politics rarely waits for perfect fairness. Octavian had found a story that made Antony's eastern policy sound like betrayal. The breach with Octavia deepened the story. Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister had once helped hold the Roman world together after the war at Perugia. Her reputation for dignity gave Octavian a moral contrast he could use without much decoration. When Antony's life with Cleopatra became impossible to ignore, Octavia's position turned into public evidence against him. Octavian did not need to speak only of provinces and titles. He could speak through the injury done to a Roman wife, a Roman sister, and a woman whose conduct seemed to embody the restraint Antony had abandoned. Household order and imperial politics met in the same accusation. The Senate was drawn into the process carefully. Antony still had supporters in Rome, and many senators disliked Octavian or feared him for reasons that were hardly imaginary. His own past included the proscriptions, land confiscations, Perugia, and years of triumviral command. Yet Antony's absence from Italy weakened him, while Octavian's nearness to Rome strengthened every gesture he made. The publication or forced disclosure of Antony's will, kept with the Vestal Virgins according to ancient accounts, became one of the decisive acts of political theatre. Its reported provisions, especially those involving Cleopatra and burial in Alexandria, allowed Octavian to present Antony's identity as no longer fully Roman in loyalty or imagination. War was formally declared not against Antony but against Cleopatra. This distinction mattered. It allowed Octavian to avoid, at least in public language, the appearance of raising one Roman army against another for personal supremacy. Antony's supporters could be treated as men compromised by a foreign queen rather than citizens defending a rival Roman commander. The oath taken by Italy and the western provinces in support of Octavian gave the coming campaign the appearance of a collective Roman response. That oath would later occupy a place in Augustus's own memory of events, because it helped transform his personal rivalry into something that looked like national defense. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their strength in Greece. Their forces were large, their resources considerable, and their cause not yet hopeless. Antony had commanded armies across much of the Roman world and still possessed the loyalty of many experienced men. Cleopatra brought ships, money, and the wealth of Egypt, without which Antony's eastern strategy would have been far weaker. They established themselves near the Ambracian Gulf, with Actium at the mouth of that waterway, a place where geography itself would press on every decision. A fleet inside such a position needed supplies, room, and confidence that the sea remained open. Agrippa again became Octavian's most important practical advantage. He did not rush toward one dramatic encounter. Instead, he worked against Antony's position by pressure, movement, and control of supply. He captured points along the coast, disrupted communications, and made the large Antonian force feel the limits of its own size. Ships and soldiers gathered in one place could become a sign of strength, but they also had to be fed and maintained. Disease, shortage, and uncertainty could weaken an army before battle settled anything. Agrippa's method turned geography into a slow instrument. Inside Antony's camp, the problem was not only military. Roman officers serving with him did not all view Cleopatra's presence in the same way. Some accepted her resources as necessary. Others found her influence damaging or humiliating, especially because Octavian's propaganda had already taught Romans to see her as the true enemy. Antony's old reputation as a generous commander and soldiers' leader still mattered, but it competed now with doubt about his judgment. When high-ranking men defected to Octavian, they did not merely change sides. They carried information, prestige, and confirmation that Antony's coalition was less firm than it looked. Cleopatra's position was also more complex than Roman hostile tradition allowed. She was not merely the ruin of Antony, though later Roman memory often preferred that shape because it made the story easier to tell. She was Queen of Egypt, guardian of her dynasty, mother of children whose future depended on the outcome, and ruler of the wealthiest kingdom tied to Antony's cause. Her presence at Actium reflected political necessity as much as personal attachment. If Antony won, Egypt's place in the eastern settlement would be secured. If he lost, Cleopatra knew that Octavian would not treat her kingdom as a normal ally whose errors could be forgiven. As the campaign lengthened, Antony's choices narrowed. He could try to break out by sea, withdraw toward a new position, or risk the slow decay of his forces where they were. The large fleet available to him was impressive in number and scale, with many heavier ships. But heavy ships were not always the answer to a campaign shaped by maneuver and strain. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's influence, was better suited to the conditions that had developed. The question became less whether Antony could display power than whether he could preserve enough of it to continue the war elsewhere. The Battle of Actium came on the 2nd of September, 31 BC. It should not be imagined as a clean contest in which two equal visions of Rome met and one immediately vanished. Much of Antony's plan seems to have involved breaking through the blockade and escaping with part of the fleet, treasure, and Cleopatra's squadron, rather than fighting to complete destruction in the Gulf. When the lines engaged, the struggle unfolded slowly, with ships seeking advantage under difficult conditions. Cleopatra's ships moved out through the opening, and Antony followed. To Octavian's side, and to later Roman storytelling, this could be framed as abandonment. Strategically, it may have been an attempted withdrawal to continue the war. Whatever Antony intended, the result damaged him beyond repair. Many of his remaining forces, left without the same center of command, eventually surrendered. Men who might have fought for Antony in a different situation now had to decide whether loyalty to a defeated leader outweighed the advantages of accepting Octavian's victory. Civil war repeatedly forced Romans into such calculations. Honor mattered, but survival, rank, property, and the future of families mattered too. After Actium, the future increasingly seemed to belong to Octavian. Octavian understood the value of the victory, but he also understood the need to shape its meaning. Actium became the battle in which Rome had been saved from Cleopatra, Eastern luxury, and Antony's surrender to foreign influence. That version did not include every truth, but it was politically elegant. It allowed Romans to celebrate a victory that had in fact destroyed another Roman army. It placed Cleopatra at the center of danger, Antony as the man lost to her, and Octavian as the defender of Italy. The battle's memory was therefore built almost as carefully as the campaign itself. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria, where the last act of their power unfolded. Egypt still possessed wealth, defenses, and symbolic grandeur, but the momentum had changed. Octavian advanced with the patience of a man who knew that the enemy's political structure was breaking before its walls fully yielded. Antony tried to recover strength and dignity, yet defections and despair narrowed his options. Cleopatra sought ways to preserve herself, her children, or perhaps her throne under terms Octavian might accept. Both knew that a living Cleopatra displayed in a Roman triumph would serve Octavian's victory more than her own memory. Alexandria surrendered in 30 BC. Antony died there after the final collapse of his position, and Cleopatra followed soon afterward, choosing death rather than the humiliation Octavian intended for her in Rome. The physical details were shaped by ancient fascination and later legend, especially the famous story of the asp, but the political meaning is clearer than the instrument. Antony's death removed Octavian's last great Roman rival. Cleopatra's death ended the independence of the Ptolemaic kingdom. The city that had once seemed able to rival Rome as a stage of Eastern power now became the place where that rival vision came to rest. Caesarion's existence created a final and delicate danger. As the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, he could not be allowed to remain a living symbol against Octavian's adoption. In strict Roman political terms, Octavian's claim rested on Caesar's will and lawful adoption, while Caesarion's claim rested on blood outside a Roman marriage and outside the usual structures of Roman inheritance. Symbolically, however, blood could still trouble the imagination. Octavian's advisors are said to have reduced the matter to a hard principle. Too many Caesars were unsafe. Caesarion was killed, and the name of Caesar passed without a living Egyptian rival. Cleopatra's children by Antony were treated differently. They were brought into the Roman settlement, and Cleopatra Selene in particular would later be married to Juba II of Mauritania, joining defeated royal blood to Rome's wider client system. This distinction shows Octavian's political precision. Not every enemy child had to die. The dangerous claim was specific. Caesarion touched Caesar's inheritance directly. Antony's children could be managed through display, custody, marriage, and time. The new order would be severe where necessary and absorbent where useful. Egypt itself was too valuable to be treated like an ordinary province under senatorial command. Octavian made it his own domain in a special sense, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank rather than by a senator. Senators were restricted from entering without permission. The arrangement protected Rome from the possibility that another great aristocrat might use Egypt's wealth and grain as the base for independent power. It also gave Octavian access to resources that would help him pay soldiers, settle debts, and present victory as relief. Egypt's annexation was therefore not an afterthought to romance and tragedy. It was one of the foundations of the regime to come. Actium and Alexandria left Octavian alone at the summit of Roman power, but solitude at the summit was not yet a constitution. He had defeated Sextus Pompey, pushed aside Lepidus, overcome Antony, ended Cleopatra's kingdom, and removed Caesarion. Still, Rome had memories of kings, hatred of civil war, and a political class trained to fear any man who appeared too openly supreme. Octavian's next task would be harder than victory in one sense, because victory could be won by armies, fleets, money, and timing. Rule had to be made acceptable in daily public language. The fall of Antony and Cleopatra therefore closed the age of open rivals while opening the problem of settlement. Octavian could return to Rome as conqueror, but he could not simply call himself monarch. He had to turn Egyptian treasure into payment, military dominance into peace, and personal supremacy into a form that senators could honor without admitting their own defeat too plainly. Actium gave him command of the Roman world. Egypt gave him the means to stabilize it. The next chapter belongs to the strange transformation by which the victor of civil war came home carrying treasure, prisoners, honors, and the burden of making one-man rule look like the restoration of Rome. Chapter 10. Egypt, Treasure, and the Return to Rome. Egypt gave Octavian more than victory over Antony and Cleopatra. It gave him the means to make victory feel useful. For years, Rome had lived under the weight of civil war, veteran claims, confiscations, naval danger, political executions, and the uncertainty that followed every temporary settlement. A commander who merely defeated his last rival might still be feared as the next tyrant. A commander who returned with wealth, grain, peace, and the promise of order could begin to turn fear into dependence. Egypt made that transformation possible because it was rich enough to pay for memory as well as policy. Alexandria had been the last stage of Antony and Cleopatra's resistance, but once it surrendered, it became the first great possession of Octavian's new world. The city had long stood as one of the Mediterranean's most brilliant centers, Greek in language and royal in ceremony, with palaces, libraries, temples, harbors, and the accumulated prestige of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Its wealth did not lie only in royal treasure. Egypt possessed fertile land along the Nile, administrative traditions refined over centuries, and a grain supply that mattered deeply to any ruler who wished to hold Rome steady. To control Egypt was to control a storehouse, a treasury, and a symbol at once. Octavian treated Egypt with unusual caution because its power was too concentrated to be entrusted to an ordinary senator. Under the Republic, major provinces were often governed by men of senatorial rank, and a wealthy province could become the base of a dangerous career. Egypt was different. If a great Roman aristocrat commanded its grain, money, and troops, he might one day stand where Antony had stood, with Alexandria behind him and Rome within reach through hunger. Octavian therefore placed Egypt under a prefect of equestrian rank, a man below the senatorial order and dependent on the princeps. Senators were not allowed to enter Egypt without permission. The rule was practical, not decorative. That decision showed how much Octavian had learned from the civil wars. Power did not need to be announced in the loudest possible language. It could be built into appointments, restrictions, ranks, and access. Egypt was made part of Roman rule, but not part of the senatorial career system in the usual way. Its governor was not another aristocrat gathering glory. Its revenues and grain were tied closely to Octavian's command. The arrangement kept a dangerous province useful and kept ambitious senators away from the most tempting base in the Mediterranean. The Nile Valley became one of the quiet foundations beneath the future Principate. Caesarion's fate belonged to the same logic of controlled danger. He was young, but youth had not made Octavian harmless when Caesar's will named him heir. Caesarion was the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, and while his legal position in Rome was far weaker than Octavian's adoption, his symbolic position could not be ignored. A living son by blood could become a banner for men who disliked the adopted son's supremacy. Octavian had built his entire rise on being Caesar's heir. There could not be another Caesar around whom Eastern memory, Egyptian loyalty, or Roman resentment might gather. Caesarion was killed, and ancient writers later preserved the hard reasoning around his death in compressed form. The exact words attributed to advisors may be literary, but the policy itself is unmistakable. Octavian removed the one child of Cleopatra whose existence touched his own claim most directly. Antony's children by Cleopatra were spared, brought into the Roman settlement, and eventually absorbed into dynastic arrangements. Cleopatra Selene would later marry Juba Theta of Mauritania, a learned client king whose own life had been shaped by Roman victory. This difference in treatment was not softness. It was discrimination of risk. Some defeated children could be displayed, educated, married, and used. Caesarion could not. Cleopatra herself was dead before Octavian could bring her to Rome in triumph. That deprived him of a living captive whose display would have made his victory even more visible, but it also removed a dangerous focus of fascination. Cleopatra had already been turned in Roman propaganda into the foreign queen who threatened Roman order through Antony. Alive, she might have complicated that story by speaking, bargaining, or drawing pity. Dead, she could be shaped more easily by Roman memory. Octavian could present her as the defeated queen whose ambition had nearly carried Antony away from Rome and whose kingdom now belonged to the victor. The treasure of Egypt allowed Octavian to do what exhausted states most urgently require after civil war: pay. Soldiers needed rewards. Veterans needed settlement. Debts and obligations had gathered around every stage of conflict. Earlier, the proscriptions and confiscations had raised money through terror and property seizure, leaving scars on Roman society. Egyptian wealth offered a less domestically destructive source of relief. Coin, bullion, royal stores, and provincial revenues gave Octavian room to satisfy claims without making Italy bear every cost directly. Money could not erase memory, but it could reduce the number of men with immediate reasons to rebel. Rome felt the effect. Ancient writers connect the influx of Egyptian wealth with changes in credit and property, because large quantities of money entering a strained economy could ease pressure and alter prices. The precise economic mechanics are difficult to reconstruct in full, but the political impression matters. Octavian could return not only as victor, but as the man through whom abundance entered the capital after years of shortage and fear. A city that had known blocked grain routes under Sextus Pompey and confiscated lands after Philippi could understand the difference between war that took and victory that paid. His return to Rome in 29 BC was staged with care. Triumphs were celebrated over Illyricum, Actium, and Egypt, allowing Octavian to display victory in a sequence that made his supremacy visible without reducing everything to a war against fellow Romans. The Egyptian triumph carried the richest symbolic burden. Cleopatra was absent in body, but her image could be shown. Her children appeared within the ceremonial order of defeat. Spoils, captives, soldiers, insignia, and representations of conquered power moved through Rome under the gaze of citizens who had watched the Republic tear itself apart for more than a generation. Public spectacle helped translate suffering into achievement. A Roman triumph was never only a parade. It was a ritual of state memory, placing the victorious commander before gods, senate, soldiers, and people in a carefully ordered movement through the city. The general wore special dress, received acclamations, and displayed the fruits of conquest. In older Republican terms, triumph belonged to a magistrate whose victory increased the glory of Rome and his family. Octavian's triumphs after Actium did something larger. They announced that the cycle of rivals had ended. Pompey's line was gone from war. Brutus and Cassius were gone. Antony was gone. Cleopatra was gone. The procession made absence visible. The closing of the doors of the Temple of Janus carried a quieter but equally powerful message. Roman tradition held that the doors stood open in wartime and were closed when peace prevailed throughout Rome's domains. The historical exactness of such peace could always be debated, because the Roman world was large and violence never vanished completely. Yet the symbol mattered because Romans understood it as rare. To close Janus was to claim that the civil storms had reached rest under Octavian's authority. The gesture did not say that Rome had become a monarchy. It said something more acceptable. War had ended, and the gods could witness the condition of peace. Peace was the word Octavian needed most, but peace had to be handled carefully. Too much emphasis on his own military supremacy could remind Romans of Caesar's dictatorship and the fear of kingship. Too little emphasis on victory would waste the legitimacy won through Actium and Egypt. Octavian therefore moved between triumph and restraint. He accepted honors, displayed success, and paid obligations, while also preparing the language of restoration. The question was no longer whether he held power. Everyone who mattered knew that he did. The question was what public form could contain that power without forcing Rome to admit that the Republic had ended in plain words. The Senate still mattered in this calculation. It had lost the ability to command events independently, but it retained the authority to clothe events in Roman legitimacy. Senators had names, priesthoods, offices, ancestral houses, and the ceremonial power of recognition. Octavian did not need to abolish them. He needed them to participate in the new arrangement, partly because their participation made his supremacy less lonely and less visibly violent. A ruler standing above all institutions looks like a king. A ruler honored through old institutions can appear as the savior of those institutions, even when he has become their master. The people mattered differently. They needed distributions, games, security, grain, and relief from the fear that another armed faction would soon demand allegiance. Octavian's public generosity after Egypt helped bind them to the new order. Caesar's funeral had first shown the political force of gifts promised to the people. Octavian had inherited that lesson along with Caesar's name. Now he could practice generosity from a stronger position, using Egyptian resources to make the ruler's advantage feel like the city's recovery. In public life, gratitude often grows where material relief meets ritual display. Veterans formed a third audience, perhaps the most dangerous if neglected. They had made every stage of Octavian's rise possible, but soldiers settled into civilian life could become unstable if promises failed or new commanders tempted them. Payments and colonies helped transform armed loyalty into social placement. The earlier confiscations in Italy had shown the cost of veteran settlement when resources were scarce and resentment high. Egyptian wealth gave Octavian more room to manage the transition. He needed soldiers to remember him as the commander who paid, not only as the commander who demanded. The annexation of Egypt also changed the map of Roman imagination. For centuries, Rome had expanded through conquest, alliance, and provincial rule, but Egypt carried a special aura. It was ancient even to the ancients, with monuments, priesthoods, and royal traditions older than the Roman Republic itself. Greeks had ruled it since Alexander's conquest, and the Ptolemies had made Alexandria a capital of learning and dynastic display. Now that long royal line ended under Roman authority, Octavian could present the result as the defeat of a queen. But beneath that language lay a greater fact. One of the richest monarchies of the Mediterranean had become part of the structure supporting one Roman supremacy. In Rome, monuments and building projects began to take on new importance. Victory could be fixed in stone, temples, dedications, and public spaces. Octavian had already understood the value of images and ceremonies, but after Egypt, he possessed the resources to build more extensively and the political need to make reconstruction visible. A city exhausted by civil war could be invited to see renewal around it. Public works did not merely beautify Rome. They gave the population evidence that the age of destruction was giving way to repair. Stone had political patience. It remained after speeches ended. Still, Octavian could not escape the memory of how he had reached this point. The proscriptions, Perugia, the manipulation of legality, and the long partnership with Antony were all part of his path. Later Augustan memory would soften much, emphasizing peace, restoration, piety, and order. But in 29 BC, the living generation knew the rougher record. Many senators had lost relatives or property. Many Italian communities remembered confiscation. Many soldiers remembered shifting allegiances. Octavian's achievement lay not in making these memories disappear at once, but in creating conditions under which people had reasons to speak less of them. That is why the return from Egypt is one of the great turning points in the story. Octavian had won the last war, but he had not yet invented the Augustan settlement. He had treasure, armies, prestige, and control over Rome's food and future. He had also inherited the Roman hatred of kings, the exhaustion of the Senate, the expectations of the people, and the danger that any man too visibly supreme might be compared to Caesar in the months before the Ides of March. The victor had to become something other than dictator, something other than triumvir, something other than king. The solution would come through one of the most careful political performances in Roman history. Octavian would appear to give power back. The Senate would appear to receive it. Provinces, commands, titles, honors, and responsibilities would be arranged so that the Republic could be spoken of as restored, while the real center of command remained with one man. Egypt had supplied the wealth, Actium had supplied the victory, and Rome had supplied the fear that shaped what could be said aloud. The next stage would begin in the Senate, where Caesar's heir prepared to lay down extraordinary power in a manner that ensured he would not truly lose it. Chapter 11. The Republic restored in name. Octavian's most important victory after Actium was not fought with ships. It took place inside the language of the Roman state, where offices, honors, commands, and old constitutional memories had to be arranged so that one man could remain supreme without appearing to stand outside Rome's traditions. He had defeated Antony and Cleopatra, taken Egypt, returned with treasure, and closed the doors of Janus as a sign of peace. Yet victory alone could not answer the question that had haunted Roman politics since Caesar's dictatorship. What could Rome call a man who held more power than anyone else if it still refused to call him king? The danger was not imaginary. Caesar had accepted honors that made many Romans believe he stood too close to monarchy, and the memory of his murder still lay behind every public gesture Octavian made. A Roman aristocrat could seek glory, command armies, triumph over foreign enemies, and rise above his peers for a season. What he could not safely do was make permanent supremacy look too naked. The old hatred of kingship had never prevented powerful men from dominating the Republic, but it shaped the forms through which domination had to pass. Octavian needed power to endure, and endurance required restraint in appearance. For several years after the defeat of Antony, Octavian held extraordinary authority inherited from the triumviral age and confirmed by victory. That authority had been useful in war, but in peace it looked increasingly difficult to justify. The triumvirate had been created to restore the state, and if the state was now restored, then the exceptional command should in theory come to an end. A cruder ruler might have kept the emergency alive. Octavian chose a subtler path. He would appear to surrender power, and by doing so he would receive it back in a cleaner, more acceptable form. In January 27 BC, he came before the Senate and declared that he was giving control of the state back to the Senate and people of Rome. The act was carefully judged. It did not mean that he intended to retire into private life. It meant that the basis of his supremacy would change from revolutionary command to public settlement. The Senate, grateful, frightened, dependent, and politically exhausted, responded by granting him honors and commands that preserved the reality of his position. What looked like renunciation became renewal. The Republic was restored in speech, while the instruments of power remained in his hands. The settlement divided the provinces in a way that revealed the arrangement beneath the ceremony. Provinces that were peaceful and did not require large military forces could be assigned to the Senate. Provinces where legions were stationed especially those on frontiers or in unsettled regions, remained under Octavian's command for a fixed term that could be renewed. This was the heart of the matter. The Senate received dignity, administrative space, and the comforting appearance of old authority. Octavian retained the armies. In Roman politics, the man who held the armies did not need to win every argument in the Senate. Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt belonged to the sphere that mattered most for military command and imperial security. The senatorial provinces could be governed by proconsuls, preserving the career patterns and honors of the aristocracy. The imperial provinces, though not yet described in all the later language that would develop around them, were tied to Octavian's authority through legates and appointed officials. The arrangement gave the ruling class a share in government without giving it the means to challenge the center. It also allowed Octavian to present his command as service in the dangerous parts of the empire, rather than possession of the whole. The Senate then granted him the name Augustus. This title deserves attention because it did not sound like an ordinary office. It carried associations of reverence, religious dignity, and something set apart from common use. He had been born Gaius Octavius, had become Gaius Julius Caesar through adoption, had been called Octavian by later historical habit, and now received a name that made his supremacy feel sanctioned rather than seized. Augustus did not mean king. It did not abolish the Senate. It did not declare monarchy. Yet it lifted him above ordinary competition, placing his person in a field of honor where rivalry became harder to imagine. Other honors surrounded the title. Laurel trees were placed at his doorway, and the civic crown, the corona civica, was awarded as a sign that he had saved citizens' lives. The golden shield was placed in the Senate house, recording virtues such as courage, clemency, justice, and piety. These honors were not ornamental in the shallow sense. Rome read public objects as political language. A doorway, a crown, a shield, an inscription, and a name could teach citizens how to understand the new order without requiring a formal lesson. Augustus stood before Rome not merely as the winner of civil war, but as the man to whom public gratitude had been made visible. The title Princeps also became central to the tone of the regime. It meant first man, or leading citizen, and it had republican ancestry because prominent senators had long been described as first among their peers in dignity and influence. Augustus used this language because it softened supremacy without denying eminence. He did not need to call himself monarch. He could be the first citizen in a restored republic, the man whose authority was greatest because his service and honors were greatest. The phrase carried one of the central fictions of the new order, that unequal power could still be spoken of through the language of civic precedence. For the Senate, the settlement offered both humiliation and relief. Many senators understood perfectly well that their independence had narrowed. Some had fought for or against different factions through the civil wars. Others had survived by silence, adjustment, or loyalty to whichever power stood nearest. After years of proscriptions, confiscations, military pressure, and uncertainty, a stable hierarchy under Augustus could seem preferable to another round of aristocratic competition backed by armies. The Senate lost the possibility of ruling Rome as it had once imagined itself ruling, but it retained rank, offices, ceremony, and a place in the performance of government. Augustus needed that performance. A ruler who bypassed the Senate too openly would have looked like a tyrant standing alone above the old state. A Senate that publicly honored him made his supremacy appear consensual, Roman, and lawful. This was not merely deception. It was a working arrangement between unequal partners. Senators could govern provinces, hold magistracies, sit in judgment, debate, advise, and display ancestral dignity. Augustus could guide the whole structure, intervene where necessary, and keep command of the military foundations. The Republic's facade was not empty plaster. It was an inhabited building whose strongest walls had been quietly moved. The people of Rome received the settlement differently. They were less concerned with the precise division of provincial authority than with peace, grain, games, money, security, and the absence of immediate civil conflict. Augustus had learned from Caesar's funeral, from Sextus Pompey's blockade, and from the pressures of veteran settlement that popular legitimacy had material forms. A restored republic that did not feed the city would fail in the streets before it failed in constitutional theory. Public generosity, building projects, spectacle, and the regularity of supply helped make the new political order feel beneficial. The people did not have to understand every legal adjustment to recognize a calmer city. Veterans also remained central. Augustus's command over military provinces gave him the ability to manage the legions and their expectations. The army could no longer be allowed to become the private ladder by which rival aristocrats climbed towards supremacy. Yet, Augustus himself had risen through soldiers' loyalty, and he understood how dangerous unpaid or unsettled troops could be. The settlement of 27 BC did not solve every military problem, but it placed the legions within a structure increasingly tied to one central authority. Republican competition had produced commanders with armies. The Principate would try to make armies belong to the Roman state through the person who embodied its command. Agrippa's role in this period remained important, even when he stood below Augustus in public precedence. He had won battles, secured the sea against Sextus Pompey, helped make Actium possible, and continued to serve as the practical partner behind the regime's stability. In a different political world, such a man might have become a dangerous rival. Under Augustus, Agrippa became the indispensable ally whose loyalty allowed power to spread without fragmenting. His presence showed that the new system did not depend only on one man's image. It required trusted agents who could command, build, administer, and remain bound to the center. The settlement's genius lay partly in its refusal to define itself too sharply. Rome was not told that the Republic had ended. It was told that disorder had ended, that extraordinary powers had been laid down, and that dangerous provinces required Augustus's continued care. Old offices continued. Consuls were elected. The Senate met. Magistrates held their titles. Laws were passed. Priests performed rituals. The calendar of public life remained recognizably Roman. Beneath that continuity, the decisive questions of command, patronage, military loyalty, and imperial direction now flowed toward Augustus. There was also a psychological settlement beneath the legal one. Romans had to be allowed to stop fighting without confessing too openly that the old republic had failed. Augustus gave them a way to do that. Senators could say they had restored constitutional order. Veterans could say they had followed Caesar's heir to peace. Citizens could say the gods had favored Rome after long suffering. Augustus could say he had returned the state to the Senate and people, while holding the authority necessary to prevent the old violence from returning. Each group received a version of events it could live with. The name Augustus helped carry that shared fiction forward. Names had shaped his whole life. Octavius had been the young man from Velitrae. Caesar had been the adopted son, heir and avenger. Imperator marked command and victory. Augustus gave him a public sanctity suited to peace. It did not erase the proscriptions, Perugia, or the wars against fellow Romans, but it allowed memory to move toward a different emphasis. The man who had once survived by ruthless necessity could now be presented as the guardian of order, the restorer of temples, the protector of citizens, and the fatherly figure toward whom later honors would gather. Still, the settlement of 27 BC was not final. Augustus's position remained delicate because he continued to hold the consulship year after year, and that repeated occupation of the highest magistracy created new tensions. Ambitious senators found the path upward narrowed when the same man remained permanently at the top of the annual order. His authority was stable, but its form still placed too much weight on one traditional office. If the new regime was to endure, it needed a way for Augustus to stand above the magistracies without visibly monopolizing them. The first settlement had restored the republic in name and secured command in practice, but it had not yet perfected the machinery. That machinery would be adjusted in 23 BC, when Augustus stepped back from the continuous consulship and accepted powers that were less familiar to the eye but more durable in use. Tribunician authority would give him a civic presence in Rome. Superior imperium would let his command outrank others where necessary. The princeps would no longer need to hold the same office every year in order to remain first in every meaningful sense. The Republic had been restored in name. Now the new system had to learn how to function without appearing to depend on permanent emergency. Chapter 12. Princeps, Senate, and the new machinery of power. Augustus had restored the Republic in name, but the settlement of 27 BC still left his power too visible in one place. He held the consulship year after year, and every year that he held it, another Roman aristocrat did not. The consulship remained the summit of traditional public life, the office through which noble ambition had long announced itself before the city. For Augustus to occupy it continuously gave him dignity, but it also reminded the Senate that the old ladder of honors now ended beneath one man's feet. A restored republic could tolerate a first citizen more easily than it could tolerate a permanent consul. The problem was delicate because Augustus did not need less power. He needed power arranged in a form that created less friction. The settlement of 27 had given him command over the most important military provinces, and the Senate had granted him the name that marked his elevated status. Yet political forms mattered in Rome almost as much as political facts. If too much authority remained attached to the annual consulship, the system would look like a magistracy stretched beyond its proper shape. Augustus required a different foundation, one that allowed him to guide Rome without blocking every ordinary path of aristocratic advancement. The crisis of 23 BC gave that adjustment its setting. Augustus fell seriously ill, and for a time the question of succession became unavoidable before the system had fully learned how to answer it. He handed his signet ring to Agrippa, a gesture that later observers found significant because the ring gave access to correspondence, instructions, and the practical business of command. At the same time, he gave public documents to the consul Gaius Octavius Piso. The distinction mattered. Agrippa held the trust of the household and military partnership. Piso held the visible continuity of the state. Even near illness, Augustus divided personal confidence and public legality with care. His recovery did not remove the lesson. The regime needed a structure that could survive illness, absence, and the ordinary operation of public offices. Augustus resigned the consulship and stopped holding it continuously. This opened the annual magistracy again to more senators and reduced one of the most obvious signs of monopoly. But he did not retire from power. Instead, he received tribunician power, renewed annually and later counted as one of the measures of his reign. Through it, he gained the sacrosanct standing, initiative, and protective language associated with the tribunes of the plebs, without actually becoming an ordinary tribune. Tribunician power was well chosen because it reached into Rome's deepest republican memory. The tribunes had originally stood as protectors of the plebeians against magistrates, and their persons were treated as inviolable. They could propose legislation, intervene in public business, and claim a moral relationship to the people. Augustus's use of this authority allowed him to appear not merely as commander of armies, but as guardian of citizens inside the civic life of Rome. It gave him a domestic authority that did not depend on the consulship. A power born from republican conflict became one of the pillars of monarchic stability. Alongside tribunician authority stood superior imperium, often described as maius imperium, which ensured that Augustus's command could outrank other governors where the needs of the empire required it. The detail can sound dry, but it carried enormous practical weight. Provincial governors still existed. Senators still received provinces. Military commands still used familiar Roman language. Yet when Augustus's authority crossed the same field, it stood above theirs. He did not have to govern every province directly in order to be superior within the whole provincial order. The system allowed others to act while making clear whose command framed their action. The combination was elegant because it joined two different worlds of power. Tribunician authority tied Augustus to the people, the city, and the language of protection. Superior imperium tied him to armies, provinces, and the command structure of empire. The consulship had been an old annual office with a colleague and a term. These newer arrangements allowed his power to be continuous without appearing as a crude seizure of every magistracy. Augustus could stand inside Rome as protector and across the empire as commander, while ordinary offices continued beneath him. The machinery was becoming less theatrical and more durable. For the Senate, this adjustment brought relief mixed with subordination. More men could now reach the consulship, which preserved the dignity of the aristocratic career and softened resentment among families accustomed to public honor. The consulship also became more flexible, with suffect consuls allowing several men in a year to enjoy the rank and its future privileges. Senators could still govern, judge, debate, build reputations, and serve the state in recognizable ways, but their authority lived within a structure whose highest appeal remained Augustus. Their careers continued. Their independence did not return in its older form. Augustus understood that aristocrats needed honors if they were to accept hierarchy. He did not abolish competition, he managed it. Offices, priesthoods, provincial posts, triumphal ornaments, seats near power, marriage connections, and personal favor all became part of the new order of ambition. A senator could still rise, but rising increasingly meant rising through a world watched by the princeps. This was not the sudden silence of the nobility. It was the conversion of noble rivalry into service beneath a permanent superior. The Republic's old hunger for honor was preserved, then redirected. Agrippa's position in this machinery remained exceptional. He had the military record, technical ability, and personal loyalty necessary to stand close to Augustus without becoming an immediate threat. After the settlement of 23, Agrippa received powers that made him a partner in the regime's stability, including important commands in the East and later tribunician authority of his own. This was not equality in the old republican sense, but it was more than ordinary service. Augustus needed a man through whom authority could operate when he was absent or ill. Agrippa became the trusted extension of power, powerful enough to be useful and loyal enough to be safe. The public language of the regime still avoided monarchy. Augustus was princeps, the first citizen, a title that rested on precedence rather than kingship. He could sit among senators, consult them, accept honors from them, and claim to act through old forms. The word emperor in the later sense can mislead if it is pressed too simply onto these years. Romans knew the title imperator as a mark of military command and acclamation. Augustus's supremacy was real, but it lived inside a cluster of powers rather than inside a single crown. That cluster was part of its strength. Ceremony helped the arrangement feel natural. Senate meetings continued. Magistrates entered office. Laws were proposed, and public business moved through familiar channels. The city did not wake one morning to find its institutions abolished. Instead, Romans saw the same names of offices placed within a different balance of force. A consul still had lictors, a praetor still presided in courts, a governor still traveled to a province with rank and attendance. Yet behind those visible continuities stood the knowledge that Augustus held the final weight of military command, public prestige, and political arbitration. The settlement also changed how time itself marked power. Republican magistracies were annual, and their rotation had once been a guard against domination. Augustus's tribunician power, renewed and counted year by year, created another rhythm. His authority did not vanish at the end of a term in the way ordinary office did. It accumulated continuity. Later, Romans could count the years of his tribunician power as a way of dating his rule, which shows how a republican instrument had become a measure of personal reign. The old language remained, but its use had been altered by permanence. Provincial government became one of the clearest places to see the new order working. In senatorial provinces, proconsuls could still hold authority according to traditional patterns. In imperial provinces, legates governed on Augustus's behalf, especially where legions were stationed. Egypt remained under its special equestrian prefect, separated from senatorial ambition because its wealth and grain were too dangerous. The empire therefore did not become uniform, it became layered. Different provinces had different administrative forms, but the layers together protected the central fact of Augustan command. This layered structure had advantages beyond control. It reduced the likelihood that any single senator could gather the combination of army, wealth, and provincial base that had made earlier civil war leaders so dangerous. It allowed Augustus to reward supporters without surrendering the most sensitive resources. It kept aristocrats employed in government while preventing them from becoming independent military dynasts. In the background stood the memory of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, and Sextus Pompey. Augustus's system was built by a man who had survived the consequences of aristocrats commanding too much for too long outside ordinary restraint. The people of Rome experienced much of this indirectly. They did not need to know every distinction between tribunician authority and superior imperium to recognize that one man now stood behind grain, games, buildings, public order, and the promise of peace. Augustus's authority touched their lives through distributions, spectacle, urban improvements, and the reduced fear of armed conflict inside Italy. His tribunician power gave a public language to this relationship, presenting him as protector rather than master. The fiction was useful because it connected ordinary security to an office associated with popular defense. There were still dangers. A system built around one man had to face the question of what happened when that man died. The illness of 23 BC had exposed the uncertainty, and the prominence of Agrippa suggested one answer without completing it. Augustus could distribute powers, elevate relatives, arrange marriages, and honor colleagues, but succession remained more difficult than administration. Rome had no accepted royal inheritance, and Augustus could not announce a dynasty too plainly without damaging the republican surface he had worked so carefully to preserve. The machinery of power had become more stable. The machinery of succession remained unfinished. The settlement of 23 BC therefore marks one of the decisive steps in the making of the Principate. Augustus no longer needed to dominate Rome by holding the consulship every year. He could stand above the system through powers that looked republican in origin and permanent in effect. The Senate regained room to breathe, but not the old command of the air around it. Magistrates returned to motion, but their motion ran inside a larger design. Augustus had become less visibly exceptional and more securely central, which was the deeper achievement. From this point onward, the story of Augustus is less a tale of sudden conquest than of ordering. Power had to enter households, laws, temples, provinces, armies, roads, and memory. The princeps, who had learned to disguise supremacy within republican forms, now turned that same discipline toward Roman society itself. Peace needed moral language, rule needed public virtue. A city that had survived civil war would be invited to see itself as ancient, disciplined, pious, and renewed. The next chapter begins where state machinery meets the household, in marriage laws, restored temples, poets, and the difficult attempt to make Rome's private life serve Augustus's public order. Chapter 13. Marriage laws, temples, and the moral city. Augustus did not leave peace as a military achievement alone. Once the armies had been settled, the offices rearranged, and the Senate placed within the new machinery of power, he turned toward the more intimate question of what Rome was supposed to become after civil war. A city could be governed by commands, but a society had to be taught how to describe itself. Augustus wanted Rome to appear ancient again, disciplined again, pious again, and capable of believing that the violence through which he had risen had led back to order rather than only to domination. This ambition carried him into the household. Roman political life had always treated the family as more than private arrangement, especially among the elite. Marriage joined houses, produced heirs, transferred property, and created alliances through which public careers could be strengthened. The old aristocracy had never separated domestic life entirely from the state, because lineage gave men names before office gave them authority. After the civil wars, however, Augustus presented household disorder as part of Rome's larger moral exhaustion. If the city had been renewed, its families had to show renewal too. The marriage laws associated with Augustus were therefore not decorative reforms. They tried to shape conduct among citizens, especially the upper orders, by rewarding marriage and childbearing while penalizing celibacy, childlessness, and adultery. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, passed in 18 BC, and later measures in the same moral program, placed public pressure on private decisions. Men and women of certain ranks were expected to marry within acceptable social boundaries. Fathers of children received advantages. Those who remained unmarried or childless could face restrictions in inheritance. Rome's ruling class was being told that its bodies, marriages, and households belonged to the future of the state. Adultery legislation carried an even sharper edge. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis treated adultery not merely as a family matter but as a public offense. A husband was expected to act under the law when his wife's adultery was discovered, and a father held severe rights in certain circumstances. Trials, penalties, exile, and confiscation made sexual conduct part of public discipline. The law did not create Roman concern with female chastity or legitimate descent. Those concerns were older than Augustus. What changed was the state's claim to regulate them through a moral program attached to the princeps himself. The policy made sense within Augustus's public image. He had presented himself as restorer, not innovator. Temples were repaired, priesthoods honored, ceremonies revived, and ancestral customs praised. The family could be placed inside the same language of restoration. A Rome that married properly, produced legitimate heirs, honored the gods, and restrained appetite, could be described as returning to itself after the looseness and violence of civil war. The claim was attractive because it made peace feel moral, not merely convenient. Augustus was not only ending war, he was asking Romans to believe that order had a character. The difficulty was that Roman aristocratic life did not obey moral legislation with the simplicity that public inscriptions preferred. Elite marriages remained political instruments. Divorce was common among the upper classes when alliances shifted or heirs were needed. Augustus himself had used marriage as statecraft, marrying Scribonia, then divorcing her and marrying Livia while she was pregnant by her former husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero. Such arrangements were not unusual in the world of Roman power, but they sat uneasily beside a program that praised discipline and domestic restoration. The Augustan household, like every great Roman household, lived inside the tensions it publicly tried to resolve. Livia occupied one of the most important places in this moral and dynastic world. She was Augustus's wife, partner in public dignity, and a figure through whom the regime could display matronly restraint, continuity, and elite seriousness. Ancient writers later gave her immense influence, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with suspicion, because powerful women near succession often attracted stories shaped by fear. What is clear is that her presence helped stabilize the image of the ruling house. She connected Augustus to the Claudian line through her sons Tiberius and Drusus, and she gave the new regime a domestic center that could be honored without being called royal. Julia, Augustus's daughter, carried a different burden. As his only biological child, she became one of the most valuable figures in the politics of succession. Her marriages were not simply private choices. She was first married to Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and early hope, after his death to Agrippa, the indispensable commander and partner of the regime, and later to Tiberius, Livia's son, when succession had to be rearranged again. Through Julia, Augustus tried to bind the future of the Principate to blood, loyalty, and utility at once. Her life shows how a woman of the imperial house could be central to power without holding office. The tragedy of Julia's position is that the moral program associated with her father eventually turned against her. In 2 BC, she was accused of adultery and sexual misconduct, and Augustus responded with severity. She was exiled to the island of Pandateria, deprived of ordinary comfort, and separated from the public world for which her marriages had been arranged. Ancient sources present the scandal with varying degrees of hostility and fascination, and some details may have been sharpened by political rumor. The broad fact remains: the daughter of the man who legislated Roman morality became the most famous victim of the moral order attached to his name. Augustus treated Julia's exile not as a private embarrassment to be hidden, but as a public wound requiring punishment. This may have been personal anger, political necessity, or both. If he spared his own daughter while others suffered under the adultery law, the moral program would look hollow. If he punished her, he damaged his own household and succession plans. The choice reveals the cruelty of a regime that turned family into public symbolism. Julia was not only a daughter who had offended a father, she was the living test of whether Augustus's laws could reach the house of Augustus. The exile to Pandateria had a stark material quality. The island lay off the Italian coast, small and isolated, suitable for removing someone from Rome without turning punishment into execution. Julia's mother, Scribonia, accompanied her voluntarily, a detail that gives the episode one of its few softer human edges. The woman whose marriage to Augustus had been set aside long before returned to stand near the daughter whose value had been consumed by dynastic politics. Public law had spoken, but the last visible loyalty around Julia belonged to a mother in exile. The scandal also touched the men around Julia, some of whom were punished as adulterers or conspirators. Iulus Antonius, son of Mark Antony and Fulvia, was among those destroyed in the affair, and his involvement gave the episode another political shadow. The son of Augustus's old rival had lived inside the reconciled aristocratic order, but scandal could reopen the memory of older conflicts. In Augustan Rome, adultery, ambition, poetry, and treason could be made to stand uncomfortably close together. Private misconduct was rarely allowed to remain entirely private when succession and memory were at stake. While the household carried these pressures, Augustus worked to make the city itself speak the language of renewal. He boasted later that he had restored 82 temples in a single year, a claim preserved in his own account of his achievements. The number mattered because it turned piety into visible administration. A temple repaired was a roof, a column, a dedication, a priesthood, a ritual calendar, and a public reminder that the gods of Rome had not been abandoned after years of bloodshed. Religious restoration allowed Augustus to present his rule as continuity with ancestral devotion rather than a break imposed by force. The Temple of Apollo on the Palatine was especially important. Apollo had been associated with Octavian's victory at Actium, and the Palatine itself was the hill of Augustus's residence. Placing Apollo's temple near his house joined private space, divine favor, and public memory with great precision. The arrangement did not need to call Augustus a king. It placed him physically near a god connected to victory, order, and cultured refinement. Romans could walk through a city where architecture taught them that the princeps lived close to sacred favor while still remaining within recognizable Roman forms. The Forum of Augustus extended this language further. Its temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, looked backward to the vow associated with vengeance for Caesar and forward to the regulated public life of the new regime. Statues of great Romans and Julian ancestors arranged memory into a corridor of legitimacy. Young men assuming the toga of adulthood could be brought into this space. Victorious generals could deposit insignia there. The old Roman past was not left scattered in family stories and senatorial speeches. It was organized in stone under Augustan supervision. Literature became another instrument of renewal, though not a simple department of propaganda. Maecenas, Augustus's trusted associate and patron, helped gather poets whose work would shape the emotional memory of the age. Virgil's Aeneid connected Rome's destiny to Trojan suffering, divine command, and the future greatness of Augustus's line. Horace's poetry moved between private moderation, public celebration, and reflections on Roman discipline. Livy's History of Rome, written in this wider Augustan atmosphere, looked backward toward the virtues, failures, and examples of earlier generations. These writers were not merely taking dictation from power, they worked within a world where power had made certain questions unavoidable. The Aeneid in particular gave Augustan Rome a story deeper than civil war. Aeneas did not found Rome directly, but his journey led toward the future city through duty, loss, divine pressure, and sacrifice. For readers under Augustus, this mattered because it made Roman greatness feel older than recent violence and more solemn than personal ambition. The poem's vision was not simple praise. It carried sorrow as well as destiny, and that complexity helped it endure beyond the political needs of the moment. Augustus's regime benefited from literature that could make rule feel fated without making it feel cheap. Horace offered another register of Augustan order. His odes could praise restored temples, moral discipline, and the closing of civil conflict, yet they also knew the fragility of private life and the limits of ambition. Maecenas appears in his poetry not only as patron, but as a figure within a world of friendship, status, and cultivated retreat. The regime needed such voices because law alone cannot make an age feel civilized. Verse, memory, ritual, and architecture gave the new order texture. They helped Romans inhabit peace as something more than the absence of battle. Still, Augustan moral renewal always carried an unresolved contradiction. The man who restored temples had risen through proscriptions. The ruler who punished adultery had made dynastic marriages serve political necessity. The princeps who praised ancestral restraint commanded a system born from the failure of ancestral politics. This does not make the renewal meaningless. It makes it Roman. Augustus's genius lay in understanding that societies can live with contradiction when the contradiction is given ceremony, law, and visible benefit. Rome did not have to forget everything. It had to learn which parts of memory could be honored, which could be softened, and which could be made useful. The moral city Augustus tried to build was therefore both sincere and strategic. He seems genuinely to have valued order, discipline, piety, and family continuity, but he also understood their political value. Marriage laws supported succession and elite reproduction. Temple restorations tied his rule to divine favor. Patronage of literature gave Rome a past grand enough to contain the present. Public punishment of Julia showed that the laws could reach even the ruler's bloodline, though at terrible cost. The city was being taught that peace required conduct, not only obedience. As the Augustan order spread, Rome itself became a kind of argument in stone and ritual. Restored shrines, new forums, repaired ceremonies, moral statutes, family arrangements, and poems of destiny all pointed toward the same claim. The age of civil war had ended because Rome had been returned to its proper shape, yet the proper shape was new in its center. Augustus stood behind the restoration, arranging the old world around himself so carefully that novelty could appear as recovery. The household, the temple, and the poem each became part of the same settlement. But the city was only one part of the empire Augustus had to govern. Beyond Rome lay provinces, roads, armies, tax systems, governors, client rulers, colonies, frontiers, and millions of people whose lives were shaped less by moral laws in the capital than by administration across distance. The Principate could not endure only through marriage reform, temple marble, and carefully guided memory. It needed routines that would work far from the Palatine, in provincial towns, military camps, tax offices, and along the roads that carried commands outward. After the moral city came the ordered empire. Chapter 14. Roads, Provinces, and the Ordering of the Empire. The empire Augustus governed was too large to be held by ceremony in Rome alone. A restored temple could teach the capital how to remember itself, and a law on marriage could press the ruling class toward the future he wanted. But most people under Roman authority never stood in the forum of Augustus or watched the Senate honor the princeps. They met Roman power in other forms. A governor arrived with attendance and legal authority. A tax assessment was recorded. A road was repaired. A soldier received pay. A local magistrate learned which Roman official could confirm a privilege or settle a dispute. Empire endured through these repeated contacts, far from the marble language of the capital. Augustus inherited a Mediterranean world already transformed by centuries of Roman expansion. Sicily, Spain, Greece, Asia, Syria, Africa, Gaul, and other regions had entered Roman power at different times and under different arrangements. Some places remembered conquest as recent, others had lived under Rome long enough for provincial routines to become familiar. Cities kept their councils, elites, temples, languages, festivals, and local rivalries, but they now operated inside a wider structure whose final authority lay with Rome. The Republic had often governed this world through annual magistrates and ambitious aristocrats who saw provinces as stages for wealth and reputation. Augustus had to keep the empire useful without letting it become a collection of private power bases. The division of provinces after the settlement of 27 BC formed one of the foundations of that solution. Peaceful provinces, those without large standing armies, could be assigned to the Senate. More dangerous or strategically vital provinces, especially those with legions, remained under Augustus's authority. This arrangement preserved senatorial dignity while securing military command for the princeps. A senator could still travel to govern Asia or Africa and return with honor. A legate of Augustus might govern Syria, Gaul, or Spain in the name of the man whose authority stood above ordinary competition. The old career continued, but the sharpest instruments were kept in one hand. This did not make provincial government uniform. Roman rule had always been uneven, adapting to local arrangements when adaptation served control. Some cities possessed freedom or special privileges, others paid tribute under more direct supervision. Client kings still ruled on the edges of empire, holding their thrones through loyalty to Rome and usefulness to Augustus. In some regions, older Greek civic traditions remained important. In others, tribal structures, local aristocracies, or recently conquered communities required different treatment. The Augustan Empire was not a flat surface pressed from Rome onto every place. It was a layered order, with Rome at the top and many local forms preserved beneath it. Census-taking helped make that layered world legible. Augustus later recorded in the Res Gesti that he conducted censuses of Roman citizens, listing enormous totals that showed both administrative reach and public authority. A census was not only a count of bodies, it touched status, property, military obligation, taxation, and the relationship between household and state. In the provinces, registration and assessment could be more complicated, shaped by local practice and Roman need. To count was to claim knowledge. To claim knowledge was to prepare the ground for taxation, service, and legal classification. Empire began in part when names and property could be written down in ways officials trusted. Taxation was one of the most sensitive parts of Roman rule, because it turned conquest into routine. Under the Republic, tax farming had often allowed publicani, private contractors, to collect revenues in ways that created resentment and abuse. Augustus did not abolish every older practice at once, and provincial finance remained varied, but his reign moved toward closer oversight and more regularized administration. Tribute, customs, dues, rents, and local obligations had to be collected without pushing provinces into revolt or allowing collectors to become independent powers. The task required records, officials, local cooperation, and enough restraint to make payment predictable. Predictable extraction was one of the less visible achievements of stable rule. In Egypt, the system took a special form. The country remained under an equestrian prefect, not a senatorial governor, because Augustus understood the danger of allowing a senator to command Egypt's grain and wealth. The Nile Valley had long traditions of bureaucratic management, and Roman rule could use existing structures while keeping the province closely tied to the princeps. Grain shipments from Egypt mattered greatly for the capital, and control over them gave Augustus both practical security and political leverage. A bad harvest, a disrupted shipment, or a careless prefect could have consequences in Rome's streets. Egypt's administration therefore belonged to the empire's daily survival, not merely its map. Roads made another kind of order visible. Roman roads had existed long before Augustus, but his reign repaired, extended, and organized the network with new political meaning. Roads carried soldiers, messengers, officials, tax revenues, merchants, and legal authority. A milestone did more than mark distance. It named power in stone, telling the traveler who had built or restored the way and tying local movement to imperial benefaction. In Italy, Augustus took responsibility for major roads and assigned curators to supervise them. Beyond Italy, roads followed armies and administration, binding provincial interiors more securely to Roman command. The road was also a promise of speed. Rome could not govern the empire instantly. but it could reduce delay. News from a frontier, orders from the princeps, petitions from cities, and reports from governors all depended on movement through space. The cursus publicus, the imperial transport and communication system associated with Augustus, developed to support official travel and messages through stations, animals, and authorized use of resources. It was not a postal service for ordinary private convenience. It was a state instrument meant to make the command of one center more practical across distance. The empire's size made such systems necessary because power that cannot hear and answer becomes local power in disguise. Military organization stood behind all of this. Augustus reduced and regularized the armies after the civil wars, settling veterans and shaping the legions into a more permanent imperial force. The exact numbers shifted across the reign, but the principle mattered more than any single figure. The legions were no longer supposed to be temporary tools raised by competing aristocrats for personal campaigns. They became standing forces tied to the princeps, stationed in provinces where frontier pressure or internal risk required them. Soldiers served for long terms, received pay, and expected discharge benefits. Their loyalty was still personal in feeling, but the system worked to make that loyalty belong to the Augustan state. The creation of the aerarium militari, the military treasury, in AD 6 addressed one of the most dangerous old problems: how to pay and retire soldiers without turning every discharge into a political crisis. Augustus funded it in part from his own resources and established taxes to support it, including inheritance and auction taxes. Veterans needed rewards, but repeated land confiscations in Italy could not remain the normal method of payment without reopening the wounds of the triumviral years. A treasury dedicated to military pensions made service more predictable and reduced the temptation for armies to look only to a commander's private promises. The change did not remove military politics, but it gave the system a firmer floor. Colonies remained part of the settlement of soldiers and the spread of Roman influence. Veterans were placed in communities across Italy and the provinces, where they carried language, legal habits, cults, and loyalty to the Augustan order. A colony could reward service and secure a region at the same time. It could also create tension with local populations whose land or status was altered by settlement. Augustus's challenge was to use colonies as instruments of stability without repeating the uncontrolled bitterness of earlier confiscations. In many places, veteran settlement became part of the slow Romanization of provincial life, though that word can flatten the variety of local responses. Provincial elites were essential to the system. Rome did not have enough officials to administer every town directly, and it rarely wanted to. Local aristocrats collected revenues, held municipal offices, financed buildings, sponsored games, served in councils, and competed for honor within frameworks Rome approved. Augustus could bind these elites through citizenship grants, privileges, priesthoods, and access to Roman favor. In the Greek East, cities might honor him with temples, festivals, or inscriptions. In the West, emerging municipal elites could find advancement through cooperation with Roman authority. Empire worked best when local ambition learned to speak in Roman terms. The imperial cult became one of the most delicate ways this loyalty was expressed. In Rome itself, Augustus avoided the plain language of living divinity, though honors around his person carried sacred resonance. In the provinces, especially in the East, where ruler cult had older traditions, worship of Rome and Augustus could become a public form of allegiance. Temples and priesthoods dedicated to Roma and the princeps gave communities a way to display loyalty while competing for prestige. The practice did not mean every provincial person thought about Augustus in the same theological terms. It meant that reverence, politics, and civic honor could be joined in ritual form. Agrippa's work helped give the empire practical shape. He was not only the victor of No Locus and the indispensable commander at Actium, he also oversaw building, water supply, mapping, and provincial arrangements. His interest in measurement and infrastructure suited the Augustan need to make the world governable. A map of the empire associated with his work, later displayed publicly, expressed something more than geography. It suggested that Roman power could see and organize the space it ruled. Measurement did not equal control by itself, but it gave control a language of distance, boundary, and extent. Cities felt Augustan order through buildings as well as officials. In the provinces, local benefactors and imperial agents restored temples, built theaters, repaired walls, laid out forums, and dedicated structures in honor of Augustus and his family. Architecture created a shared public vocabulary across places that remained culturally distinct. A provincial town did not become Rome, but it could display Roman forms of prestige. Inscriptions naming Augustus, governors, magistrates, donors, and local councils tied the city's visible life to the imperial hierarchy. Stone made loyalty readable. Law moved more unevenly, yet it too belonged to the ordering of the empire. Roman citizens carried privileges that distinguished them from non-citizens. Local laws remained in many communities, but Roman governors could hear cases, issue edicts, and intervene in disputes. The spread of citizenship was still limited compared with later centuries, but under Augustus it remained a valuable grant. It rewarded service, bound local elites, and created personal relationships with the Roman order. Legal status became one of the ways empire could sort people without erasing every local identity. Frontiers required a different kind of attention. Augustus expanded Roman control in some regions and stabilized it in others. But he did not imagine frontier policy as endless conquest without limit. Spain was gradually pacified after hard campaigns in the north. Alpine regions were brought more firmly under Roman control, improving communications between Italy and Gaul. In the Balkans and along the Danube, Roman authority pressed into difficult terrain and complicated local societies. In the east, diplomacy with Parthia achieved what battlefield ambition had often failed to secure, including the return of standards lost by Crassus. Augustus could present diplomacy as victory when the result served Roman honor. Germany showed the limits of that order. Roman ambitions beyond the Rhine advanced under commanders such as Drusus and Tiberius, and for a time it seemed possible that Roman provincial structure might extend deeper into German lands. Roads, forts, negotiations, and campaigns tried to make the region legible to Roman command. Then came the disaster of AD 9, when Publius Quinctilius Verus lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. The defeat shocked the Augustan system because it revealed that organization, confidence, and administrative intent could fail against terrain, local resistance, and misjudged alliances. Augustus's empire was powerful, but it was not without edges. The Varian disaster did not destroy the Principate, yet it changed the meaning of expansion. The loss of legions was not only military, it was administrative, psychological, and symbolic. Rome had imagined a region moving toward provincial order, and the defeat showed that conquest did not become government simply because officials expected it to. Augustus is said to have mourned the lost legions intensely, and whether later memory shaped the scene or not, the scale of the blow was real. Afterward, the Rhine frontier gained a more lasting importance as a boundary of Roman control. Order sometimes meant accepting a limit. In the Res Gestae, Augustus presented his achievements through a careful accounting of offices, honors, expenses, buildings, gifts, victories, settlements, and foreign embassies. The document is not neutral history. It is the Princeps explaining himself to posterity in the language he wished Rome to remember. Yet its very structure tells much about his regime. He wanted power to be seen through countable acts. Money given, temples restored, citizens counted, soldiers settled, standards recovered, provinces pacified, honors received and sometimes declined. The document makes rule appear as service measured in public facts. That habit of accounting suited the wider empire he ordered. Augustus's power rested not only on charisma or fear, though both had their places. It rested on the ability to turn command into procedures that others could repeat. A governor could receive instructions, a soldier could expect pay, a tax could be assessed, a road could be maintained, a city could honor the princeps, a census could classify households, a veteran could be settled, a frontier could be watched. None of these actions alone made an emperor. Together, repeated across years and provinces, They made the Principate part of ordinary life. The cost of this order should not be hidden. Roman peace was built on conquest, taxation, hierarchy, and military force. Provincial people did not all experience it as relief, and local resistance did not vanish because Augustus described his rule as restoration. Some communities benefited from stability, trade, infrastructure, and access to Roman favor. Others carried burdens of tribute, land loss, military occupation, or political subordination. The Augustan Empire could be admired for its administrative patience without being mistaken for gentle rule. Its calm surface rested on the disciplined management of unequal power. Even so, the achievement was extraordinary in Roman terms. The late Republic had sent powerful men into provinces and watched them return with armies, money, clients, and ambitions large enough to threaten the state. Augustus arranged the empire so that provincial opportunities served the center more reliably. Senators still governed, local elites still competed, soldiers still won distinction, but the pathways of advancement increasingly bent toward the princeps. The empire that had once fed aristocratic rivalry was being reorganized to support imperial continuity. This reordering also changed Augustus himself. In the earlier chapters of his life, he survived as heir, avenger, triumvir, rival, and victor. In the mature Principate, he became a manager of systems too large for any single person to touch directly. His authority appeared in men he appointed, roads he authorized, treasuries he funded, settlements he approved, and documents that counted what had been done. The young man who once needed Caesar's name to gather soldiers now ruled through a web of offices and routines that made his absence less dangerous than it would once have been. Yet the larger and more orderly the system became, the more urgent the question of succession grew. Roads could continue, taxes could be collected, soldiers could be paid, and provinces could be governed, but only if the center remained accepted after Augustus was gone. The empire had been arranged around the princeps, and the princeps was mortal. Agrippa had served as partner and support, but he too would die. Marcellus, Julia, Gaius, Lucius, Drusus, and Tiberius would each enter the problem in turn. After the ordering of provinces came the more fragile ordering of a household that had to carry the future of the Roman world. Chapter 15: Heirs, Losses, and the House of Augustus. Succession was the problem Augustus could never make fully Roman. He had built a system that refused to call itself monarchy, and that refusal had helped make the system acceptable. The Senate still met, magistrates still held office, provinces still carried old names, and the princeps could speak as the first citizen rather than as a king. Yet the power gathered around him was personal enough that Rome had to ask what would happen when he died. A republic did not need an heir in the royal sense. The Principate did. This difficulty lay beneath the whole later life of Augustus. He could arrange offices, grant honors, adopt sons, and marry relatives into positions of expectation, but he could not openly say that the Roman world now belonged to a dynasty in the manner of an Eastern kingdom. That language would have injured the careful settlement he had spent decades constructing. At the same time, leaving the future vague would invite the very disorder his reign claimed to have ended. Succession had to be prepared without looking like succession, and the household of Augustus became the place where that contradiction lived most intensely. Marcellus was among the first figures through whom hope gathered. He was the son of Augustus's sister Octavia, and his connection to the ruling house gave him a natural place in early plans. Young, noble, and tied closely to the princeps by blood, he seemed to offer continuity without the complications that later candidates would carry. Augustus married him to Julia, his only daughter, in 25 BC, a union that brought together the two strongest lines of expectation within the family. The marriage did not declare Marcellus heir in a formal royal sense, but Romans understood the language of proximity. A young man married to Julia and favored by Augustus did not need a crown to be noticed. Marcellus's promise was brief. In 23 BC, the same year Augustus's own illness had exposed the fragility of the new system, Marcellus died. He was still young, and his death entered Roman memory with a softness sharpened by poetry. Virgil's later evocation of him in the Aeneid gave the lost youth a place in Augustan sorrow. making private dynastic failure part of Rome's larger imagined destiny. The political effect was immediate. The first simple hope had vanished, and Julia, still central to the future, had to be joined elsewhere. The house of Augustus could turn grief into ceremony, but ceremony did not solve the practical question left behind. Agrippa then moved closer to the center of succession. He had never been merely a subordinate, though he remained loyal with extraordinary consistency. He had defeated Sextus Pompey's fleet, helped secure Actium, served in major offices, organized provinces, built public works, and stood near Augustus in moments when the regime needed a second man strong enough to carry authority. After Marcellus's death, Augustus arranged Julia's marriage to Agrippa. The match was practical, perhaps even severe in its clarity. Julia brought blood from Augustus. Agrippa brought competence, loyalty, command, and the trust of the ruler whose system he had helped create. Through Julia and Agrippa, the succession seemed to find a stronger foundation. Their children included Gaius Caesar and Lucius Caesar, whom Augustus adopted as his sons in 17 BC. The adoption placed the boys directly into the Julian line and gave Rome visible heirs without requiring Augustus to speak in royal terms. Public life began to shape itself around them. They received honors early. Their images and names circulated through the empire. Cities learned how to flatter the future by honoring the children of the princeps. In a state that denied monarchy, two boys could still be raised under the gaze of the whole Roman world. The adoption of Gaius and Lucius also shows how Roman family law could carry the weight of empire. Adoption was an old and respectable practice among elite families, used to preserve names, property, and lineage when natural sons were absent or when political advantage required it. Augustus had himself become Caesar's son by adoption, and that legal act had changed history. Now he used the same institution to shape the future after him. A household mechanism became a constitutional instrument. The continuity of the Roman world was being prepared through the transfer of names inside one family. Agrippa's death in 12 BC disturbed that preparation, but did not immediately destroy it. His sons remained, and Augustus could still look toward Gaius and Lucius as the next generation. Yet Agrippa's absence removed the adult partner who had long made Augustan power more practical. Few men had ever stood so close to supremacy without breaking from it. His loyalty had allowed Augustus to distribute command without fearing a rival center. Once Agrippa was gone, the young heirs were still too young to carry the same weight, and the family's older male figures became more important again. Among them stood Tiberius. Tiberius came from Livia's earlier marriage to Tiberius Claudius Nero, and through his birth he belonged to the Claudian nobility, one of Rome's oldest and proudest aristocratic houses. He was not Augustus's biological son, but he had grown within the ruling household after Augustus married Livia. His younger brother Drusus also became a figure of military distinction and public affection. The two brothers gave the regime a connection to old republican nobility, military service, and Livia's influence. They were useful to Augustus, but usefulness did not mean preference. For many years, Tiberius seemed necessary without being loved as the chosen future. Drusus's career in the north brought glory to the Augustan house. He campaigned in Germany and along the frontiers with energy that Romans admired, extending Roman influence and gathering military honor. His death in 9 BC, after an accident during campaigning, deprived the family of another promising figure. Drusus left sons of his own, including Germanicus and Claudius, but they belonged to a later stage of the dynastic problem. For Augustus, Drusus's death was another narrowing. The house remained full of names, but each death changed the arrangement of expectation. Succession, in theory, could be managed through law and adoption. Succession in life remained vulnerable to illness, accident, and time. Tiberius's position became more strained when Augustus required him to divorce Vipsania Agrippina, Agrippa's daughter whom he loved, and marry Julia after Agrippa's death. The marriage joined him to Augustus's bloodline and placed him more centrally within dynastic planning. It also made clear that personal happiness had little room where succession was concerned. Vipsania was removed because the needs of the ruling house had changed. Julia, who had already been married to Marcellus and Agrippa, now became the link through which Tiberius was bound more tightly to the future. The household was being arranged as a map of power, and the people inside it had to live where they were placed. The marriage between Tiberius and Julia was unhappy. Ancient sources preserve the bitterness of the arrangement, and even allowing for hostile storytelling, the strain is not difficult to believe. Tiberius was disciplined, reserved, and proud. Julia was the daughter of Augustus, mother of the adopted heirs, and a woman whose life had long been used for political design. Their union served the state more than the people within it. Tiberius's withdrawal to Rhodes in 6 BC was therefore both personal and political. He left Rome, removed himself from the center of expectation, and created a problem for Augustus at a moment when Gaius and Lucius were still being prepared. Rhodes was not exile in the formal punitive sense, but it had the quality of retreat. Tiberius lived away from Rome, studying and passing time while the imperial household continued without him. Augustus did not welcome the withdrawal. A man placed near succession could not easily choose absence without seeming to reject the role given to him. Yet Tiberius had reasons to feel trapped. He had been required to abandon a beloved wife, marry into a political arrangement, and serve beneath a plan that favored Julia's sons. He was necessary as a soldier and administrator, but not embraced as the desired heir. His departure exposed the emotional cost of being useful without being chosen. Gaius and Lucius, meanwhile, were advanced with care. They were given the title Principes Juventutis, leaders of the youth, a public honor that marked them as the rising generation of the regime. They appeared in ceremonies, received attention from cities and armies, and were prepared for public life at an age that made their future visible before their experience was complete. Augustus could surround them with honors, mentors, and expectations, but he could not hurry maturity beyond its natural pace. A boy honored by the empire still had to become a man capable of bearing it. Lucius died in AD 2 at Massilia while still young. Gaius died in AD 4 after being wounded during service in the East and failing to recover. Within a short span, the future Augustus had so carefully displayed was gone. Their deaths were more than family losses. They forced a reconstruction of the entire succession plan. Statues, honors, titles, and public hopes now stood around absent figures. Cities that had honored the young Caesars had to turn their attention elsewhere. The dynastic line through Julia and Agrippa had not disappeared completely, but its two most visible sons had been removed from the path Augustus intended. Julia's own fall had already darkened the family's public image. Her exile in 2 BC under the moral laws associated with her father damaged the house that had been made into Rome's model of renewal. The mother of Augustus's adopted sons was removed from Rome in disgrace, while those sons were still central to succession. The contradiction was severe. Augustus had tried to make his family a symbol of order, but the family had become a place where law, scandal, punishment, and dynastic need collided. The princeps could command provinces and armies more easily than he could command the private conduct and public meaning of his own household. After the deaths of Gaius and Lucius, Tiberius became unavoidable. Augustus adopted him in AD 4, but even that adoption came with another layer of arrangement. Tiberius was required to adopt Germanicus, the son of his dead brother Drusus, thereby tying the Claudian line, the memory of Drusus, and the next generation into the same design. Augustus also adopted Agrippa Postumus, the surviving son of Agrippa and Julia, though that young man would later be exiled and excluded from succession. The adoption of Tiberius was therefore not a simple embrace. It was a structure built from necessity, compromise, and the remaining pieces of a family repeatedly reduced by death. Tiberius brought real qualifications. He had military experience, administrative ability, aristocratic birth, and long familiarity with the Augustan system. He had campaigned in difficult regions and could command respect from soldiers. He was not a decorative heir, yet he lacked the easy public warmth that might have made succession feel graceful. Ancient writers often present him as reserved, difficult and resentful. And although such portraits are colored by later hostility toward his reign, his personality did not lend itself to the kind of hopeful imagery once attached to Gaius and Lucius. He was the answer Augustus needed, not necessarily the answer Augustus had wanted. The later years of Augustus, therefore, carried a strange mixture of stability and narrowing. The empire itself had become more orderly. Provinces were administered through established channels. The army had been regularized. Rome's public spaces displayed the achievements of the regime. Literature, law, religion, and ceremony all supported the idea of restored order. Yet inside the ruling house, the future had passed through Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius, Drusus, Julia, Agrippa Posthumus, and Tiberius, each name altering the line. The public system looked steady. The family mechanism beneath it had been repeatedly repaired. Livia's importance grew within this narrowing. As Augustus's wife and Tiberius's mother, she stood at the meeting point between the Julian and Claudian futures. Later rumor would make her responsible for more than evidence can safely prove, because Roman political memory often explained dynastic outcomes through suspicion of powerful women. What can be said more securely is that her position mattered greatly. She represented continuity inside the household and helped connect Augustus's authority to the man who would follow him. In a regime without open monarchy, such domestic connections were political facts. Agrippa Posthumus became the most uncomfortable remaining alternative. As the son of Agrippa and Julia, he possessed blood ties that could not be ignored, but his conduct or reputation made him unsuitable in Augustus's judgment. He was eventually exiled, removing him from the active line of succession. His fate shows the severity with which Augustus treated threats emerging from his own family. The blood of the house was valuable only when it could serve order. When it seemed to endanger that order, it could be isolated as firmly as any external rival. By the final years of Augustus's life, Tiberius had become the practical successor. He received powers that placed him near the center of rule, including tribunician authority and command responsibilities. The transition was being prepared through the same language that had made Augustus's own position durable: office, power, honor, and public recognition rather than a simple royal proclamation. The Roman world was being taught to look toward Tiberius without being told that kingship had returned. The lesson had taken decades to write. Succession revealed both the strength and the weakness of Augustus's creation. Its strength lay in adaptability. When one heir died, another could be adopted, married, elevated, or recalled. Roman law and aristocratic family practice gave Augustus tools with which to rebuild the future. Its weakness lay in dependence on the household of one man. However carefully republican the language remained, the Roman world now watched births, marriages, illnesses, scandals, and deaths inside the princeps' family as matters of state. The boundary between public order and private blood had grown thin. Augustus had spent his life turning danger into structure. Caesar's murder had become inheritance. Civil war had become vengeance. Victory had become peace. Extraordinary command had become the Principate. Now bereavement, adoption, and reluctant necessity had become succession. Tiberius stood ready, not as the triumphant beloved son of a royal house, but as the surviving solution to a problem no one could openly name too plainly. The empire had roads, provinces, armies, treasuries, laws, and honors. It also had an old ruler, a prepared successor, and the approaching test of whether the Augustan system could continue after Augustus himself was gone. That test would come in AD 14. The founder's body would fail, but the offices, documents, loyalties, and expectations around him would not simply disappear. The Senate would have to respond. Tiberius would have to accept what had been arranged for him while appearing cautious before power. Livia would stand at the center of the household's final transition. The res gestia would preserve Augustus's own account of what he had done. After decades of refusing the name of king, Rome would learn whether one man's carefully shaped supremacy had become a government that could survive his death. Chapter 16, AD 14, and the shape left behind. AD 14 arrived after more than 4 decades in which Augustus had taught Rome to live beneath one man's supremacy without calling that supremacy kingship. The young heir who had returned from Apollonia with little more than Caesar's name had become an old ruler surrounded by offices, honors, documents, family arrangements, and habits of obedience. Many Romans alive at the end of his reign had no adult memory of the Republic as it had existed before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. They knew the Senate, the magistracies, the laws, and the old public words, but they knew them inside an order that had been shaped around Augustus for longer than a generation. His final years were not empty years of waiting. The succession had been narrowed through death and disappointment until Tiberius stood as the practical heir, adopted, honored, experienced, and positioned with the powers necessary to continue the regime. Germanicus had been adopted by Tiberius, keeping the wider family design alive. Agrippa Posthumus, the difficult remaining son of Agrippa and Julia, had been sent away, a living reminder that blood alone was not enough to make a man useful to the Augustan future. Livia remained beside Augustus, carrying the authority of long partnership and the importance of being Tiberius's mother. The household had become the hinge on which the Roman world would turn. Augustus's health had troubled him before, and illness had already taught the regime how dangerous uncertainty could be. In 23 BC, when he had nearly died, the question of succession had appeared before the system was ready to answer it. By AD 14, the answer was more complete, but still not simple. Rome could not openly speak as if a crown were passing from father to son. Tiberius had to appear as a citizen receiving powers from the state, a man reluctant before greatness rather than a prince merely inheriting command. The old hatred of kings still governed the theatre of accession, even after monarchy in practice had settled into the center of Roman life. The final journey of Augustus took him through places thick with his own memory. He traveled in Campania, where age, illness, and long rule drew toward their end. Ancient accounts place his death at Nola, in the same town where his father had died many years earlier. Whether that echo was felt by those around him or sharpened by later memory, it gave the end a fitting Roman symmetry. The ruler whose public identity had been remade by adoption and power still died within the geography of family, ancestry, and Italian towns older than the Principate. At Nola, Augustus's death was handled not only as a private loss, but as an act of state. The body of the princeps could not belong to the household alone, because his person had come to hold offices, oaths, honors, and expectations that reached across the empire. Messengers had to move. The Senate had to respond. Tiberius had to be placed at the center without appearing too eager for what had been arranged. Livia's role mattered immediately, and later writers, especially those suspicious of imperial households, gave her presence an atmosphere of control and secrecy. More securely, she stood at the point where domestic authority and public transition met. The death was announced to Rome, and the city received it through the forms Augustus himself had spent a lifetime preserving. There would be senatorial deliberation, funeral honors, public mourning, procession, cremation, and the elevation of the dead ruler into divine status. This was not the chaotic uncertainty that had followed Caesar's murder. No assassins stood on the Capitoline claiming liberty. No Antony displayed wounds before a crowd whose anger might overturn the settlement. No young heir waited across the Adriatic, deciding whether to accept a name. Augustus had made his death, as far as any ruler can, administratively survivable. The comparison with Caesar is one of the deepest measures of his success. Caesar died suddenly, violently, and without a political structure capable of absorbing his absence. Augustus died after years of arranging powers, honors, and succession so that absence would not immediately become civil war. Caesar's funeral had released vengeance. Augustus's funeral would confirm continuity. The difference was not that Augustus had been gentler in his rise. It was that he had learned from Caesar's failure to make supremacy durable inside Roman forms. Tiberius's accession began in a manner suited to the system's nervous language. He did not leap forward as a king claiming inheritance. He hesitated, or appeared to hesitate, before the Senate, allowing reluctance to become part of the ritual. Ancient writers later treated this hesitation as hypocrisy, and perhaps some of it was. Yet it also belonged to the political script Augustus had created. Power had to be accepted as burden, not seized as appetite. The Senate had to offer, the successor had to demur, and the final result had to look like necessity recognized by responsible men. Everyone understood the substance, but the performance still mattered. The Senate's response showed how much had changed. Under the old republic, a leading statesman's death would alter factional balance, but not require the state to transfer a central personal authority. In AD 14, the Senate had to acknowledge that Augustus's powers could not simply dissolve. The legions required a commander, provinces required appointment and oversight. Egypt could not be left exposed. The urban people still expected grain, games, and order. Magistrates could continue, but the system needed a princeps. The offices of Rome had survived Augustus, but they had survived as parts of the structure he had remade. The army gave the transition its sternest test. Legions on the frontiers were not ceremonial bodies waiting politely for constitutional clarity. They were armed communities with pay, grievances, loyalties, and memories of commanders. Mutinies among the legions in Pannonia and Germany soon revealed that the death of Augustus did not mean calm everywhere at once. Soldiers wanted better conditions, discharge, and recognition of their own claims. Tiberius had to rely on others, including his son Drusus and Germanicus, to manage these dangerous moments. The Principate could pass from Augustus to Tiberius, but the army reminded everyone that imperial power still rested on men who could demand to be heard. Germanicus' role in the Rhine armies gave him immediate prominence. He was young, admired, connected to the Julian and Claudian lines, and descended through his mother Antonia from Mark Antony and Octavia. His position showed how layered the Augustan family settlement had become. In him, old rival lines were reconciled inside the imperial house. The soldiers' affection for him was useful and dangerous at once. Tiberius needed Germanicus, but popularity in the army had always been the raw material from which Roman rivalry could grow. Augustus had reduced that danger, not abolished it. In Rome, the funeral and honors of Augustus fixed his memory in public form. His body was carried, praised, and cremated with the solemnity suited to a man who had been made larger than any ordinary citizen. The mausoleum of Augustus, begun decades earlier in the Campus Martius, received the remains of the ruler who had built it not merely as a tomb, but as a dynastic monument. The structure stood as a round, massive statement that the house of Augustus belonged to Rome's landscape. Death was placed inside architecture, and architecture gave family memory a civic form. Deification followed. Augustus became Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, officially enrolled among the gods by senatorial action. This honor did not mean that Rome had forgotten his human path through proscriptions, civil wars, calculations, and losses. Public memory rarely works by full forgetting. It works by selecting the form in which the past will be approached. The living Octavian had once needed Caesar's deification to strengthen his claim as son of a god. Now Tiberius inherited a similar advantage, though with a different temperament and a more guarded relationship to public honor. The founder's divinity became another support beneath the successor's authority. The Res Gestae gave Augustus a voice after death. This account of his achievements, prepared to be displayed on bronze pillars before his mausoleum and copied elsewhere in the empire, presented his life as a measured record of service. It listed offices held, honors received, money spent, temples restored, citizens counted, soldiers settled, games given, provinces secured, foreign kings received, and standards recovered. The style was restrained, almost accounting-like, and that restraint made the claims stronger. Augustus did not need to narrate himself as a conqueror in wild language. He could present numbers, titles, and acts, allowing the record to make supremacy look like duty fulfilled. The document also hid as much as it revealed. It did not dwell on the proscriptions, the terror of the triumvirate, the suffering around Perugia, or the full ambiguity of civil war. It did not describe the destruction of republican independence in those terms. Instead, it gave Rome the version of Augustus that Augustus wanted to leave behind: generous, lawful, victorious, restrained, pious, and repeatedly honored by Senate and people. That version was not pure invention. He had given money, restored temples, secured provinces, counted citizens, and brought long internal war to an end. But the selection was the achievement. He had learned how to make memory govern almost as effectively as law. Tiberius inherited that memory along with the machinery. His own nature was different from Augustus's, and ancient writers would later judge his reign with suspicion, bitterness, and fascination. But the crucial fact in AD 14 was that succession occurred. The system did not collapse. The Senate did not recover independent rule. The armies did not produce an immediate rival emperor, though they tested the new reign sharply. The provinces did not break away. Egypt remained controlled. The grain supply continued. Magistrates entered office. Governors served. Taxes were collected, and the name of Caesar passed into another generation of power. This continuity was the final proof of Augustus's work. A single extraordinary man can dominate a state for his lifetime through fear, talent, wealth, or fortune. It is harder to make that domination survive as an accepted arrangement after his death. Augustus did not create a written constitution in the modern sense, nor did he confess the creation of monarchy. He created habits. He made Romans accustomed to looking toward one center while still walking through old institutional doors. He allowed aristocrats to serve, citizens to receive benefits, soldiers to expect payment, and provinces to recognize authority through appointed channels. By AD 14, the new order had become familiar enough to continue. The cost of that familiarity was the old republic's political freedom. Competitive aristocratic government, already damaged before Augustus was born, did not return. Elections, offices, and senatorial debate remained, but the final range of action had narrowed beneath the Principes. Rome gained peace from civil war, more regular administration, and a political center strong enough to restrain the ambitions that had torn the Republic apart. It lost the open uncertainty through which rival nobles had once contested the future of the state. Many Romans, after the violence they had endured, may have judged the exchange tolerable. Others would have felt the dignity of the loss even while accepting the safety of the result. Augustus's life had moved through several identities, each one leaving traces beneath the next. Gaius Octavius of Velitrae had been the careful youth attached to Caesar's family. Caesar's adopted son had been the avenger who entered politics through a murdered man's will. The triumvirate had shared in proscriptions and civil war. The victor of Actium had turned Antony and Cleopatra into the final defeated danger. Augustus the Princeps had made power durable by hiding it inside restoration. At the end, Divus Augustus became the memory under which successors would rule, argue, fail, and imitate. The empire he left was not finished, because empires never are. Frontiers remained uncertain. Germany had shown the limits of expansion. Parthia still required diplomacy. Provincial burdens continued. Elite resentment did not vanish. The imperial household would carry new rivalries, new adoptions, and new griefs. Tiberius would govern in the shadow of a founder whose achievement was almost impossible to equal. Yet the basic shape had been left behind. One ruling house, one central princeps, a senate honored but contained, armies tied to the imperial command, provinces organized through layered authority, and Rome speaking of restoration while living under monarchy in all but name. The story that began with Caesar's funeral, therefore, did not end with a crown placed openly on Augustus's head. Rome never needed that scene, and Augustus was too intelligent to seek it. The transformation came through a will, a name, a funeral crowd, a series of wars, a defeated queen, a careful Senate session, powers renewed year by year, laws over households, roads across provinces, and heirs arranged through adoption. A crown would have made the change too easy to see. Augustus built something more patient and more lasting, a monarchy that could stand in public without using the most dangerous word Rome knew. After his death, The roads still ran outward from Italy, crossing bridges, milestones, river valleys, and frontier towns. In provincial cities, inscriptions still carried his name, cut into stone by communities that had learned the grammar of imperial honor. In Rome, the Senate still gathered, magistrates still wore the marks of office, and the people still moved through spaces his reign had repaired, renamed, or filled with memory. Tiberius now occupied the uneasy center, but the shape around him was Augustan. The founder had passed from action into record, from command into precedent, from living ruler into a name that later emperors would inherit as a title and burden. The bronze tablets of achievement, the stones of the roads, the restored temples, and the tomb in the Campus Martius did not explain everything. They did not tell the whole cost. They did not name every fear that had made peace acceptable. They remained all the same, physical things in the Roman world, touched by weather, read by travelers, passed by citizens, and folded slowly into the ordinary life of empire. Across that ordinary life, Augustus's settlement continued in the habits of men who did not need to remember how strange it had once been. A governor took up his province, a clerk copied a name, a soldier waited for pay, a priest performed a rite at an altar restored in the old reign. A road marker gave the distance to the next town. The empire moved through such details, not hurried, not complete, but enduring under the form he had left behind. And in the long aftersound of the age, the first emperor of Rome remained both visible and concealed. Visible in the titles, monuments, records, and succession he created, concealed behind the language of a republic he claimed to restore. Caesar's funeral had opened the future. Augustus's death showed that the future had become a system. Rome had learned to live with one ruler while still speaking in the voices of many old institutions, and that lesson would carry the empire far beyond the life of the man who first taught it. The roads remained, the inscriptions remained, the offices opened and closed with their familiar names. Morning came to the same stones, the same river, the same city of ceremonies and accounts. Far from Rome, milestones stood beside worn routes, their lettering catching light and dust in equal measure. The empire did not need to announce its transformation each day. It continued in the measured passage of orders, footsteps, carts, and names, while the memory of Augustus settled into bronze, marble, and the long road of Roman time. The journey is complete. Rest well.